Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight we descend deeper into the quiet chambers where reports are born, where the chaos of human experience transforms into the ordered language of documentation. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of these pages, where every word was chosen with care, every sentence a small act of preservation. The report began, as they always did, with the mechanical precision of a Smith Corona typewriter that had served the department for nearly 15 years. Sergeant Williams sat at his desk on the third floor of the precinct, the small pool of light from his desk lamp creating an intimate workspace within the larger darkness of the nearly empty office. His fingers moved across the keys with the practiced rhythm of someone who had written thousands of such reports, each one a careful translation of human complexity into the structured language that the law required. Case number 87 to 1142. Date October 15th, 1987. Time 14:35 hours. Location 1847 Maple Street, Apartment 3B. Nature of complaint: theft of personal property. The basic facts arrange themselves in neat rows across the page, each detail occupying its proper place in the format that had been refined through decades of police work. But beneath these essential elements lay the real story, the human drama that Sergeant Williams would spend the next hour carefully documenting. Mrs. Dorothy Chun had called the police that afternoon to report that someone had entered her apartment while she was at work and taken her late husband's watch, a gold timepiece that had been a retirement gift from his colleagues at the post office. She had discovered the theft upon returning from her job at the county library, finding her bedroom dresser, drawer open, and the small velvet box that had held the watch missing from its usual place, beside her jewelry case. Sergeant Williams had responded to the call personally, arriving at Mrs. Chun's apartment to find a woman in her 60s, composed but clearly shaken by the violation of her private space. He had conducted his preliminary investigation with the methodical patience that characterized all his work, examining the point of entry, a window that had been pried open from the fire escape, documenting the precise condition of the apartment, noting which items had been disturbed and which had been left untouched. The typewriter continued its steady percussion as Sergeant Williams described Mrs. Chun's account of discovering the theft. She had returned from work at approximately 2:15 p.m., entering through the front door and immediately noticing that something felt different about the apartment, though she could not initially identify what had changed. The living room appeared normal, with her morning newspaper still folded on the coffee table and her reading glasses in their usual place beside her favorite chair. It was only when she entered the bedroom to change clothes that Mrs. Chun had noticed the open drawer. The intruder had been selective, ignoring costume jewelry and other items of modest value to take only the gold watch that had been her husband's most treasured possession. The watch itself was valuable, but Mrs. Chun had emphasized to Sergeant Williams that its sentimental worth far exceeded its monetary value. It represented 40 years of faithful service to the postal system and had been her husband's pride during the brief period of his retirement before his death 3 years earlier. Sergeant Williams documented Mrs. Chun's description of the watch in careful detail: a gold bulova with a rectangular face in Roman numerals, bearing an inscription on the back that read, "To Harold Chun. With appreciation for 40 years of dedicated service, United States Postal Service, 1984. Mrs. Chun had provided a photograph of her husband wearing the watch, taken at his retirement party, allowing Sergeant Williams to include a precise description that would be essential for recovery efforts. The physical evidence had been limited but telling. The window screen had been carefully removed rather than damaged, suggesting someone with either experience or unusual patience. The intruder had used a thin tool, possibly a putty knife, to pry open the window latch without breaking the glass or leaving obvious scratches on the metal frame. Once inside, the person had moved through the apartment with purpose, going directly to the bedroom and spending minimal time searching through the dresser. Drawers, Sergeant Williams had dusted for fingerprints, though the surfaces had been wiped clean in the areas where the intruder had worked. The absence of prints was itself evidence, suggesting someone who understood basic crime scene procedures. More importantly, he had found footprint impressions on the fire escape, partial prints in the dust that had accumulated on the metal grating. These were photographed and measured, providing evidence that might prove valuable if a suspect was identified. The neighborhood canvas had yielded several useful observations. Mrs. Patterson from apartment 2A had been home during the morning hours and had heard what she described as footsteps on the fire escape around noon, but had assumed they belonged to the building maintenance worker who occasionally used the external stairs to access the roof. Mr. Rodriguez from across the alley had seen someone on the fire escape during his lunch break, but had been too far away to provide a detailed description beyond noting that the person appeared to be wearing dark clothing and moved with familiarity around the building's external structure. As Sergeant Williams typed these details into his report, he followed the department's established format for property crimes, but his documentation went beyond the minimum requirements. He included Mrs. Chen's emotional state, noting her particular distress at the loss of what she called her last tangible connection to her husband. He described the neat condition of her apartment, the careful way she had preserved her husband's belongings, the small shrine of photographs and mementos that occupied one corner of the bedroom dresser. These details were not strictly necessary for the legal documentation of the crime, but Sergeant Williams understood that reports served multiple purposes. They would be read by detectives who might work the case, by prosecutors if charges were eventually filed, by insurance investigators who would process Mrs. Chen's claim. Each reader would benefit from understanding not just what had been stolen, but what the theft meant to the victim. The human context that transformed simple property crime into personal violation. The typewriter ribbon was beginning to fade slightly, creating letters that were sharp at the edges but lighter in the center, giving the text a distinctive appearance that marked reports from that particular machine. Sergeant Williams made a mental note to request a new ribbon from the supply clerk, but for now he continued with the rhythm of documentation that had become second nature after 15 years of police work. He described his conversation with the building superintendent, Mr. Kowalski, who maintained that building security was adequate and that this was the first break-in he could remember in the 3 years since he had taken the position. Mr. Kowalski had provided keys for examining other apartments that faced the same fire escape, allowing Sergeant Williams to determine that the intruder had specifically targeted Mrs. Chen's unit rather than simply looking for any convenient opportunity. The neighboring apartments showed no signs of attempted entry, and their occupants reported no missing items or evidence of disturbance. This suggested that the theft had been planned rather than random, that someone had known about the watch and had chosen Mrs. Chen's apartment for that specific purpose. Sergeant Williams documented this conclusion carefully, noting the implications for the investigation that would follow. Detective Morrison had been assigned to follow up on the case, and Sergeant Williams included detailed recommendations for investigative priorities. The pawn shops in the immediate area should be contacted with descriptions of the watch, though the selectivity of the theft suggested that the intruder might not be interested in quick resale. Friends and acquaintances of Mrs. Chen should be interviewed to determine who might have known about the watch's existence and value. Building employees and former employees should be considered as potential suspects, given the familiarity with the fire escape that the intruder had demonstrated. The report included Mrs. Chen's statement that she had mentioned the watch to very few people, primarily members of her husband's former postal service colleagues who occasionally visited to check on her welfare. She had shown the watch to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, several months earlier, during a conversation about their late husbands, and had mentioned it to her own children during their occasional visits. Beyond these instances, she could not recall discussing the watch with anyone who might have used the information inappropriately. Sergeant Williams documented the insurance information that Mrs. Chun had provided, noting that the watch had been appraised at $1,800 for insurance purposes, but that replacement would be impossible due to its sentimental significance. The report included contact information for Mrs. Chun's insurance agent and a copy of the appraisal document that she had retrieved from her filing cabinet while he waited. The investigation had continued into the evening hours, with Sergeant Williams expanding his canvas to include businesses along the nearby commercial strip. The owner of Chun's Market, no relation to the victim despite the shared surname, had been working behind the counter during the lunch hours and had noticed an unfamiliar man walking through the alley behind the apartment building. The man had been carrying what appeared to be a toolbox and had seemed to be examining the buildings as he walked, though nothing about his behavior had seemed particularly suspicious at the time. This observation had been documented with particular care, including the shop owner's description of the man as middle-aged, average height, wearing work clothes that could have belonged to any number of legitimate tradesmen who worked in the neighborhood. The shop owner had provided his contact information and agreed to work with a police artist if the investigation progressed to that stage. Sergeant Williams had also contacted the Postal Service office where Harold Chun had worked, speaking with the supervisor who had organized the retirement party and who confirmed the details of the watch presentation. Several of Harold's former colleagues were still employed at the facility, and all had expressed shock at the theft of what they remembered as Harold's prized possession. None could think of anyone who might have committed such a crime, but they agreed to be available for interviews if the investigation required their testimony. The typewriter keys continued their steady rhythm as Sergeant Williams documented the procedural steps that had been followed, the evidence photos that had been taken and logged, the fingerprint cards that had been submitted to the Identification Bureau, the notifications that had been sent to area pawn shops and jewelry stores. Each step followed department protocol, but the accumulated effect was a comprehensive record that would serve as the foundation for any future investigation. Mrs. Chun's statement had been taken in detail, with particular attention to the emotional impact of the theft. She had described the watch as her husband's most treasured possession, something he had worn every day during his brief retirement and had mentioned frequently as a symbol of the appreciation his colleagues had shown for his service. The theft had violated not just her physical space, but her emotional sanctuary, the carefully maintained environment where she preserved the memory of their life together. These emotional details were documented not for their legal significance, but for their human importance. Sergeant Williams understood that crime victims needed to feel that their losses were recognized and valued, that the system they had called for help understood the full dimension of their experience. His report served as a bridge between the raw human experience of victimization and the structured processes of law enforcement and prosecution. The carbon paper had created two identical copies of the report, one for the Detective Bureau and one for the Patrol Division's files. A third copy would be provided to Mrs. Chun for her insurance claim, ensuring that she had complete documentation of the police response to her case. This attention to administrative detail was part of the larger structure that made effective law enforcement possible. The careful preservation of information that allowed cases to be tracked, investigated, and ultimately resolved. Sergeant Williams included a section in his report addressing the vulnerability of elderly residents in the neighborhood, noting that Mrs. Chun's case was part of a pattern of crimes that seemed to target older people living alone. He recommended increased patrol attention for the area and suggested that the community relations officer might consider organizing a security awareness program for elderly residents. These recommendations reflected his understanding that individual crimes were often symptoms of larger social problems that required comprehensive responses. Mrs. Chun's victimization was not just a personal tragedy but a community concern that demanded attention to prevention as well as prosecution. His report served as both a record of investigation and a call for broader police action. The investigation had revealed several aspects of Mrs. Chun's situation that extended beyond the immediate crime. She had been living alone since her husband's death, maintaining minimal contact with neighbors and family members, creating a kind of isolation that made her vulnerable to crimes that depended on knowledge of her habits and possessions. Sergeant Williams documented these observations as part of the larger social context that investigators would need to understand. At the same time, Mrs. Chun had demonstrated remarkable resilience and composure throughout the investigation process. She had provided clear, detailed information about the theft, had assisted with the physical examination of her apartment, and had expressed confidence in the police department's ability to investigate her case effectively. Sergeant Williams noted these qualities as evidence of Mrs. Chun's strength and as factors that would make her an excellent witness if the case progressed to prosecution. The report concluded with Sergeant Williams' assessment of the case's investigative potential. The physical evidence was limited but significant, particularly the footprints on the fire escape and the evidence of planning that the selective nature of the theft suggested. The witness observations provided some leads for follow-up investigation, though none offered immediate identification of suspects. Most importantly, the specific nature of the stolen item and its limited market value would make the watch easier to trace if it entered the second-hand market. Sergeant Williams had worked through the night completing his documentation, ensuring that every detail was preserved while the events remained fresh in his memory. The typewriter had produced page after page of careful description, creating a permanent record that would serve multiple purposes in the weeks and months that followed. His report was more than just an administrative requirement. It was a foundation for justice and a recognition of Mrs. Chun's loss. The desk lamp cast its circle of light across the completed pages, each one representing hours of careful investigation and thoughtful documentation. These reports were the building blocks of the criminal justice system, the careful accumulation of facts and observations that made prosecution possible and gave victims confidence that their cases were being handled with appropriate seriousness. Similar reports were being written throughout the night shift, other officers documenting other crimes in the same careful detail that Sergeant Williams had brought to Mrs. Chun's case. Each report represented a small piece of the larger puzzle of urban law enforcement, the patient work of preserving evidence and documenting human experience that formed the foundation of community safety and order. The watch case would eventually be solved, though not through dramatic detective work, but through the patient application of routine investigative procedures. The watch would be recovered from a pawn shop in a neighboring city, leading to the arrest of a building maintenance worker who had used his knowledge of apartment layouts and resident schedules to commit a series of similar thefts. Mrs. Chun would be reunited with her husband's watch, and the man responsible would face prosecution, based largely on the careful documentation that Sergeant Williams had provided. But for now, in the quiet hours of the night shift, the report stood complete as a monument to the careful work of police documentation. Every detail had been preserved, every observation recorded, every piece of evidence cataloged for future use. The typewriter had done its work, transforming human drama into the ordered language of law enforcement, creating a permanent record that would serve justice while honoring the experience of an elderly woman who had lost something precious. The carbon copies separated cleanly, each one bearing the same careful documentation that would make Mrs. Chun's case part of the permanent record of police work. These reports would be filed, indexed, and preserved, joining the vast archive of human experience that the department accumulated through its daily work. They represented more than just administrative compliance. They were acts of preservation and recognition, small monuments to the careful work of maintaining order in a complex world. In the broader context of police work, reports like Sergeant Williams represented the foundation upon which all other activities depended. Without careful documentation, crimes could not be prosecuted, patterns could not be identified, and lessons could not be learned. The patient work of officers who took the time to create comprehensive reports was what made effective law enforcement possible, creating the information base that detectives, prosecutors, and administrators needed to serve their communities effectively. The night shift continued its quiet work throughout the building, other officers completing their own reports, adding their own careful observations to the vast collection of documented human experience that filled the department's files. Each report was both an individual story and part of a larger narrative about community life, crime, and the ongoing effort to maintain social order through the patient, application of legal principles, and investigative procedures. Morning would bring new cases, new reports, and new challenges to the ongoing work of law enforcement. But for now, in the quiet hours when the city settled into its deepest rhythms of rest and reflection, the careful work of documentation continued, preserving the stories and evidence that would serve justice in the days and weeks to come. The basement archive extended further than most people realized, beyond the main filing areas that Detective Chun had explored, past the mechanical rooms and storage spaces, into sections that housed the department's oldest cases. These were the files from the 1960s and early 1970s, housed in wooden cabinets that predated the metal filing systems used elsewhere in the building. The wood had aged to a deep honey color, and the brass hardware had developed the green patina that spoke of decades in the building's humid basement environment. Archivist Margaret A. Hoffman had worked in these depths for 23 years, longer than most officers had served on the force. She knew every cabinet, every filing system, every change in organization that the department had implemented over the decades. Her small office occupied a corner of the archive, furnished with a desk that had been surplus from the Detective Bureau in 1978 and a reading table where researchers could examine files under proper lighting conditions. Margaret's work was largely solitary, involving the careful maintenance of thousands of files that represented the department's institutional memory. She cleaned and preserved documents that were beginning to show their age, created detailed catalogs of case contents, and occasionally assisted detectives who needed access to old files for cold case investigations or pattern analysis. Most of her days passed in peaceful silence, surrounded by the accumulated weight of documented history. On this particular afternoon, Margaret was working her way through Cabinet L7, one of the oldest in the archive, containing cases from 1967 through 1969. These files had not been accessed in several years, and some showed signs of deterioration that required immediate attention. She worked methodically, examining each file for damage, making notes about preservation needs, and occasionally stopping to read reports that captured her attention. The first file she pulled dealt with a missing person case from the summer of 1967. Janet Morrison, age 19, had disappeared from her apartment near the university campus, leaving behind no note, no indication of her intentions, and no obvious signs of struggle or forced entry. The investigating officer, Detective Patrick O'Malley, had approached the case with the thorough patience that characterized police work of that era. Detective O'Malley's reports, typed on onion skin paper that had yellowed with age, documented an investigation that had stretched across 3 months. Janet had been a sophomore at the local college, studying art history and living independently for the first time in her life. Her parents, contacted immediately when her roommate reported her missing, had driven down from their farm, upstate to assist with the search efforts. The initial investigation had revealed a young woman who was struggling with the transition to independent adult life. Janet's grades had been declining during her sophomore year, and she had mentioned to friends that she was considering dropping out of school to pursue what she called a more authentic way of living. Several classmates had described her as increasingly interested in the counterculture movement that was gaining momentum in the late 1960s. Though none could provide specific information about her plans or intentions, Margaret found herself drawn into the careful documentation of Janet's final weeks at college. Detective O'Malley had interviewed her professors, her classmates, her employers at the campus bookstore where she worked part-time. Each conversation had been documented in detail, creating a portrait of a young woman who was questioning the conventional path that had been laid out for her but had not yet found an alternative that satisfied her need for meaning and purpose. The most significant lead in the case had come from Janet's art history professor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had noticed that Janet's final research paper had focused on artists who had abandoned traditional society to pursue alternative lifestyles. Janet had been particularly interested in the artists' colonies that had emerged in various parts of the country, communities where creative people could live simply and focus on their work without the pressures of conventional society. Detective O'Malley had followed up on this lead by contacting several such communities within reasonable traveling distance of the college. His reports documented phone calls and letters to communes in Vermont, New Mexico, and Northern California, each inquiry carefully crafted to respect the privacy of the communities while seeking information about whether Janet might have joined their ranks. Investigation had eventually led to a commune called Mountain Dawn, located in the hills of Vermont, where residents lived collectively on a working farm and pursued various forms of artistic expression. The community's leader, a man named David Earthsong, who had legally changed his name from David Thompson, had confirmed that a young woman matching Janet's description had indeed joined their group in late July, about 2 weeks after her disappearance had been reported. Detective O'Malley had driven to Vermont personally to confirm Janet's identity and well-being, a journey that he documented with characteristic thoroughness. Mountain Dawn occupied several hundred acres of rolling farmland, with residents living in a combination of renovated farm buildings and newly constructed communal spaces. The community supported itself through organic farming, craft production, and small-scale manufacturing of goods that were sold in nearby towns. Janet, who had adopted the name Rainbow for her life at the commune, had been healthy and happy when Detective O'Malley met with her. She had expressed regret for not contacting her parents to let them know she was safe, but had been afraid they would try to force her to return to college. The life at Mountain Dawn had provided the sense of purpose and community that she had been seeking, and she had no intention of returning to what she called the artificial world of conventional society. The resolution of the case had required delicate negotiations between Detective O'Malley, Janet's parents, and Janet herself. Her parents had been torn between relief at learning she was safe and concern about the unconventional lifestyle she had chosen. Detective O'Malley had facilitated several phone conversations between Janet and her family, helping them to understand her decision while ensuring that she was not being coerced or manipulated by the commune members. The final report in Janet's file documented the agreement that had been reached. Janet would remain at Mountain Dawn, but would maintain regular contact with her parents through letters and occasional phone calls. Her parents would respect her choice to live independently and would not attempt to force her return to college, though they expressed hope that she might eventually decide to complete her education. Margaret found a follow-up report, filed 6 months later, noting that Detective O'Malley had contacted Mountain Dawn to confirm that Janet remained there voluntarily and continued to be in good health. The commune had provided character references and had invited Janet's parents to visit, which they had done during the autumn harvest season. The case had been officially closed as resolved, with Janet's status changed from missing person to voluntary departure. These old files contain dozens of similar cases, each representing a moment when the changing social norms of the 1960s had created conflicts between traditional expectations and emerging alternatives. Young people had been leaving conventional lives to join communes, protest movements, and alternative communities, often without warning their families or explaining their decisions. Police departments had been called upon to mediate between worried parents and children who were exercising their legal right to choose their own paths. Margaret pulled another file, this one dealing with a theft case from 1968 that had required unusual investigative approaches. The Riverside Art Gallery had reported the theft of several paintings during what appeared to be a sophisticated burglary that had bypassed the gallery's alarm system and avoided damage to more valuable pieces in the collection. Detective James Sullivan had investigated the case with the methodical approach that characterized his work. Throughout his 30-year career with the department, the stolen paintings were not the most valuable pieces in the gallery, but they shared common themes that suggested the thief had been motivated by more than simple monetary gain. All three paintings depicted scenes of social protest and political upheaval, subjects that were becoming increasingly relevant in the turbulent late 1960s. The gallery owner, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, had been mystified by the selection of stolen items. The paintings were worth perhaps $3,000 combined, while several pieces worth 10 times that amount had been left untouched. The thief had clearly been familiar with the gallery's layout and had known which paintings were equipped with individual alarm sensors and which relied only on the building's general security system. Detective Sullivan's investigation had revealed that the gallery had been a gathering place for local artists and intellectuals who were involved in various forms of social activism. The stolen paintings had been part of a special exhibition titled Art and Conscience, featuring works by contemporary artists who were addressing issues of war, civil rights, and social justice. Through their creative expression, the breakthrough in the case had come not through traditional detective work, but through Detective Sullivan's patient engagement with the local art community. Rather than treating the artists and gallery visitors as potential suspects, he had approached them as sources of information about the cultural and political significance of the stolen works. This approach had led him to Timothy Walsh, a local artist who had been struggling to gain recognition for his own politically charged paintings. Timothy had become increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the commercialization of art that should have been serving the cause of social change. He believed that paintings addressing serious political issues should not be hanging in galleries where they were treated as mere commodities, to be bought and sold by wealthy collectors. Detective Sullivan had found Timothy through patient interviews with gallery visitors and local artists, many of whom had mentioned his passionate discussions about the role of art in promoting social justice. When approached, Timothy had initially denied involvement in the theft, but had eventually confessed when Detective Sullivan demonstrated genuine interest in understanding his motivations. Rather than simply building a case for prosecution, the resolution of the case had been as unusual as the crime itself. Timothy had not stolen the paintings for profit, but to display them in community centers and public spaces where they could reach audiences who would never visit an upscale art gallery. He had carefully preserved the paintings and had been planning to return them to the gallery once he felt they had served their purpose as tools for social education. Detective Sullivan had worked with the gallery owner and the local prosecutor to develop a resolution that addressed both the legal violations and the underlying social concerns that had motivated the theft. Timothy had returned the paintings in perfect condition and had been allowed to organize a series of public exhibitions that brought art with social themes to community venues throughout the Mrs. Rodriguez had been initially resistant to this approach, preferring traditional prosecution, but Detective Sullivan's patient explanations had helped her understand that Timothy's crime had been motivated by passion for social justice rather than personal greed. The community exhibitions had actually increased interest in the gallery's collection and had brought new visitors who might not otherwise have discovered the gallery's educational programs. The file contained letters from community organizations thanking Detective Sullivan for his creative approach to the case and praising the educational value of the public exhibitions that had resulted from his mediation. Timothy Walsh had gone on to become a respected member of the local art community, organizing regular exhibitions that brought together artists and activists to explore the connections between creative expression and social change. These files from the late 1960s reflected the complex social changes that were transforming American society during that period. Police officers like Detective Sullivan had been called upon to navigate conflicts between traditional authority and emerging forms of social expression, finding ways to maintain order while respecting the legitimate concerns that motivated protest and dissent. Margaret continued her methodical examination of the files, occasionally stopping to read reports that illustrated the patient thoughtful approach that many officers had brought to their work during that turbulent period. She found case after case where officers had gone beyond simple law enforcement to serve as mediators, educators, and community builders, recognizing that their role extended far beyond the technical application of legal codes. One file documented a case involving a group of college students who had been arrested for trespassing while protesting the university's involvement in defense research. Rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system, the investigating officer, Sergeant Robert Chun, had organized a series of community meetings where students, university officials, and community members could discuss the issues that had led to the protest. These meetings had not resolved the underlying political disagreements, but they had created a forum for respectful dialogue that had prevented future confrontations. The students had agreed to pursue their concerns through established channels, while university officials had committed to greater transparency about their research partnerships and had created new opportunities for student input on institutional policies. Another file contained documentation of a domestic disturbance case that had evolved into a comprehensive intervention addressing the economic and social pressures that were affecting families throughout the community. Officer Maria Santos had responded to reports of loud arguments in a working-class neighborhood, but her investigation had revealed that the immediate conflict was symptomatic of larger problems affecting many families. In the area, the neighborhood had been experiencing economic decline as traditional manufacturing jobs disappeared, leaving many families struggling with unemployment and uncertainty about their futures. The arguments that had prompted the initial police call were really expressions of stress and frustration that had no other outlet in a community that was being left behind by economic changes. Officer Santos had worked with community organizations, religious leaders, and social service agencies to develop a comprehensive response that addressed the underlying causes of family stress rather than simply responding to its symptoms. Her efforts had led to the creation of job training programs, financial counseling services, and support groups that had helped families navigate the difficult transition to a new economic reality. The files documented the patient work of officers who had understood that effective police work required attention to the social conditions that created crime and disorder. They had served as bridges between communities and institutions, helping to create understanding and cooperation where conflict might otherwise have escalated into more serious problems. Margaret found herself deeply moved by the wisdom and compassion that characterize so much of the police work documented in these old files. Officers from that era seem to have had more time and latitude for the kind of creative problem solving that addressed root causes rather than just immediate symptoms. They had understood that their job was not simply to enforce laws, but to help maintain the social fabric that made community life possible. The preservation of these files was more than just an administrative responsibility. It was an act of honoring the thoughtful work of officers who had understood the complexity of their role in society. Each file represented hours of patient investigation, careful documentation, and creative problem-solving that had contributed to the safety and well-being of the communities they served. Asterisk. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret continued her careful examination of the archive, ensuring that each file was properly preserved for future researchers who might need to understand how police work had been conducted during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. These documents would serve as resources for historians, criminologists, and police administrators who were interested in learning from the approaches that had been successful in managing social change and community conflict. The basement archive held thousands of such stories, each one representing a small piece of the larger history of American law enforcement and social change. They documented the evolution of police work from simple law enforcement to the more complex role of community problem solving that had emerged during the social upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s. Margaret's work in preserving these files was part of the larger effort to maintain institutional memory that could guide future generations of police officers and community leaders. The patient, thoughtful approaches documented in these old cases offered models for addressing the kinds of social conflicts that continued to challenge communities throughout the country. The quiet of the basement archive was broken only by the soft sound of Margaret's movements as she worked her way through the files, the rustle of aging paper, and the occasional creak of the old wooden cabinets. This was the sound of history being preserved, of human experience being maintained in careful order for future generations to study and learn from. Each file represented not just a case that had been investigated and resolved, but a lesson in the complexity of human behavior and the patience required to address social problems effectively. The officers whose work was documented in these files had understood that their job required more than technical knowledge of legal codes. It demanded wisdom, compassion, and the ability to see beyond immediate problems to their underlying causes. As evening approached, Margaret completed her examination of Cabinet L7 and began the process of returning the files to their proper places. Each folder was positioned carefully, ensuring that future researchers would be able to find and access the information they contained. The archive would continue its quiet vigil over these stories, preserving them against the passage of time and the tendency of institutions to forget the lessons of their own history. The work would continue tomorrow, with other cabinets and other files requiring the same careful attention to preservation and organization. Margaret's patient work ensured that the wisdom and experience documented in these archives would remain available to guide future generations of police officers and community leaders who faced similar challenges in maintaining order while respecting human dignity and social justice. In the deeper sections of the archive, where the oldest files rested in their wooden cabinets, the stories of thoughtful police work continued their quiet existence, waiting for the next researcher who needed to understand how complex social problems had been addressed with patience, creativity, and genuine concern for community welfare. Asterisk. The old courthouse stood 3 blocks from the police station. Its limestone facade, weathered by 70 years of seasons but still commanding respect from those who approached its heavy oak doors. Built in 1923, the building had housed thousands of cases, witnessed countless moments of resolution and closure, and served as the formal heart of the community's commitment to justice under law. Officer Daniel Rodriguez had been assigned to courthouse security for the past 5 years, a position that had given him an intimate knowledge of the building's rhythms and moods. He knew which courtrooms were used for which types of cases, which judges preferred which arrangements of furniture and lighting, which attorneys were likely to arrive early and which would rush in moments before their scheduled appearances. The building's interior retained the formal grandeur that had characterized public architecture of the 1920s. High ceilings with ornate plaster, moldings created spaces that felt both imposing and dignified, while tall windows provided natural light that shifted throughout the day, creating constantly changing patterns on the polished marble floors. The woodwork throughout the building was original oak, dark with age but carefully maintained by custodial staff who understood the importance of preserving the building's historic character. Courtroom 3A had been Officer Rodriguez's primary responsibility since his assignment to the courthouse. The room could accommodate approximately 150 people, though it rarely approached full capacity except during high-profile cases that attracted significant public attention. Most days, the courtroom hosted a steady stream of routine hearings, plea agreements, and sentencing procedures that represented the bulk of the criminal justice system's actual work. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated several feet above the rest of the space, and flanked by the American and state flags that symbolized the authority under which proceedings were conducted. The witness stand occupied a position to the judge's right, positioned so that testimony could be heard clearly throughout the room while maintaining the formal dignity that court procedures required. Officer Rodriguez had observed thousands of hours of court proceedings from his position near the main entrance, watching the careful choreography of legal process unfold in the same measured rhythms day after day. The formality of court procedures had initially seemed unnecessarily complex to him, but over time he had come to appreciate the way that ritual and tradition created an atmosphere of serious purpose that helped participants focus on the important decisions being made. The attorneys who worked regularly in courtroom 3A had developed relationships with the court staff that reflected mutual respect and professional courtesy. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chun, no relation to the detective of the same name, had been prosecuting cases in this courtroom for nearly 8 years, earning a reputation for thorough preparation and fair treatment of defendants who chose to cooperate with plea negotiations. Defense attorney Michael Thompson had been practicing in the same courthouse for 15 years, representing defendants who ranged from first-time offenders charged with minor crimes to career criminals facing serious felony charges. His approach combined legal expertise with genuine concern for his client's welfare, often working with social service agencies to address the underlying problems that had contributed to their involvement with the criminal justice system. Officer Rodriguez had watched these attorneys work together on hundreds of cases, negotiating plea agreements that balanced the demands of justice with recognition of individual circumstances and the practical limitations of the correctional system. Their professional relationship exemplified the collaborative approach that made the local criminal justice system more effective than the adversarial model suggested by television portrayals of courtroom drama. The holding cells located in the basement of the courthouse provided temporary accommodation for defendants who were awaiting their court appearances. These cells were designed for short-term detention only, with basic furnishings and adequate lighting, but none of the amenities that characterized longer-term correctional facilities. Officer Rodriguez made regular checks of the holding area, ensuring that defendants were treated with appropriate dignity while maintaining the security that public safety required. The design of the holding area reflected the humanitarian reforms that had been implemented in correctional facilities during the 1970s and 1980s. Individual cells provided privacy and reduced the tensions that could develop when multiple defendants were confined together, while a central monitoring station allowed staff to maintain supervision without creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Most defendants who passed through the holding cells were there for relatively brief periods, usually just a few hours while they waited for their cases to be called, or for attorneys to complete last-minute negotiations. Officer Rodriguez had developed skills in recognizing when defendants were experiencing unusual stress or anxiety, offering appropriate reassurance while maintaining the professional boundaries that his position required. The building's architecture created natural acoustic properties that made conversations easily audible throughout the corridors and waiting areas. Officer Rodriguez had learned to identify the different types of discussions that took place in various parts of the building: attorneys conferring with clients, family members offering support to defendants, prosecutors and defense attorneys negotiating terms of plea agreements. These conversations represented the human side of the criminal justice system, the personal stories and individual circumstances that lay behind the formal legal proceedings that took place in the courtrooms. Officer Rodriguez had overheard countless such discussions over his 5 years in the building, giving him insights into the complex social and economic factors that contributed to crime and the equally complex process of addressing criminal behavior through legal intervention. The main corridor of the courthouse featured a series of portraits depicting judges who had served the community over the building's 70-year history. These portraits provided a visual reminder of the continuity of legal tradition and the accumulated wisdom that guided contemporary decision-making. Officer Rodriguez had researched several of these historical figures, learning about their contributions to the development of local legal practice and their approaches to balancing justice with mercy. Judge William Morrison had served from 1945 to 1973, presiding over the court during the social changes that had transformed American society in the post-war decades. His portrait showed a man of evident intelligence and compassion, qualities that were reflected in court records that documented his patient approach to family disputes and his innovative use of probation as an alternative to incarceration for first-time offenders. Judge Morrison had been particularly known for his work with juvenile cases, developing approaches that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment and working with community organizations to create alternatives to traditional correctional programs. His influence on local practice had extended well beyond his years on the bench, establishing precedents and procedures that continued to guide contemporary court operations. Judge Elizabeth Santos had been the first woman appointed to serve in the courthouse, taking the bench in 1976 and serving until her retirement in 1995. Her portrait captured the dignity and determination that had characterized her groundbreaking career, during which she had earned respect from attorneys and community members who had initially questioned whether a woman could handle the demands of judicial responsibility. Judge Santos had been particularly effective in cases involving domestic violence and family disputes, bringing perspectives and approaches that had improved the court's ability to address complex social problems that traditional legal remedies alone could not solve. She had worked closely with social service agencies and community organizations to develop comprehensive responses to family problems that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate legal violations. The jury deliberation rooms on the 3rd floor of the courthouse had been the sites of countless discussions where community members had wrestled with questions of guilt, innocence, and appropriate punishment. These rooms were furnished simply, with a large table surrounded by chairs and basic amenities that allowed jurors to focus on their responsibilities without distraction. Officer Rodriguez had occasionally been assigned to provide security for jury deliberations, though his role was limited to ensuring that jurors were not interrupted or influenced by outside contacts during their discussions. The confidentiality of jury deliberations was one of the fundamental principles of the legal system, and maintaining that confidentiality required careful attention to security procedures. The jury selection process that took place in courtroom 3 had always impressed Officer Rodriguez with its democratic character and its reliance on the judgment of ordinary community members. Potential jurors represented a cross-section of local society, bringing diverse perspectives and experiences to the task of evaluating evidence and determining appropriate responses to criminal behavior. Most criminal cases that came before the court were resolved through plea negotiations rather than jury trials, reflecting the practical reality that the system's capacity would be overwhelmed if every case required a full trial. Officer Rodriguez had observed hundreds of plea hearings, watching defendants accept responsibility for their actions and judges impose sentences that reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the individual circumstances that had contributed to criminal behavior. These plea hearings represented moments of accountability and resolution that were often more meaningful than the dramatic confrontations portrayed in popular media. Defendants had opportunities to express remorse for their actions. Victims could address the impact that crimes had on their lives, and judges could explain the reasoning behind their sentencing decisions. The victim impact statements that were sometimes presented during sentencing hearings had provided Officer Rodriguez with insights into the long-term consequences of criminal behavior. Victims and their family members described not just the immediate harm caused by crimes, but the ongoing effects on their sense of security, their trust in community safety, and their ability to maintain normal routines and relationships. These statements served important functions in the legal process, ensuring that victims' experiences were recognized and considered in sentencing decisions, while also providing defendants with concrete understanding of the harm their actions had caused. The formality of the court setting gave these statements particular weight and significance, creating moments of genuine communication between victims and offenders that might not have been possible in other circumstances. The probation office located on the second floor of the courthouse served defendants who had been sentenced to supervised release rather than incarceration. Officer Rodriguez had worked closely with probation officers who were responsible for monitoring compliance with court orders and providing support services that addressed the underlying problems that contributed to criminal behavior. Probation officer Jennifer Walsh had been working in the courthouse for 12 years, developing expertise in assessing defendants' needs and connecting them with appropriate community resources. Her office was furnished with comfortable seating and equipped with reference materials about job training programs, substance abuse treatment, mental health services, and other resources that could help defendants successfully reintegrate into the community. The success of probation as an alternative to incarceration depended largely on the quality of supervision and support that probation officers provided. Officer Rodriguez had observed the patient work that officers like Jennifer Walsh performed, conducting regular meetings with probationers, monitoring their compliance with court orders, and intervening quickly when problems arose that might threaten their successful completion of probation terms. Many probationers required intensive supervision and support during the early months of their sentences, as they worked to establish new patterns of behavior and address the problems that had contributed to their criminal involvement. Probation officers served multiple roles as counselors, monitors, advocates, and enforcers, requiring skills in human psychology, social work, and law enforcement. The courthouse library occupied a quiet corner of the building's second floor, providing resources for attorneys, judges, and other legal professionals who needed access to case law, statutes, and legal precedents. The library was maintained by a professional law librarian who assisted with research projects and ensured that the collection remained current with developments in legal practice. Officer Rodriguez had occasionally visited the library during quiet periods, developing an appreciation for the vast body of legal knowledge that guided court proceedings and the careful research that attorneys conducted to prepare their cases effectively. The library's peaceful atmosphere provided a sharp contrast to the more active areas of the courthouse, creating a space for contemplation and study that supported the intellectual work that effective legal practice required. The administrative offices on the fourth floor housed the court staff who managed scheduling, records, and the various procedural requirements that kept the courthouse operating efficiently. These staff members worked largely behind the scenes, but their careful attention to detail and administrative procedures was essential to the smooth functioning of the entire court system. Court clerk Margaret Thompson had been managing case scheduling and records for 22 years, developing systems and procedures that ensured cases moved through the court process efficiently while maintaining the accuracy and completeness that legal proceedings required. Her office was equipped with filing systems that contained detailed records of every case that had been processed through the courthouse during her tenure. The records maintained by the court clerk's office served multiple purposes beyond their immediate administrative functions. They provided the documentation necessary for appeals, sentencing reviews, and other legal procedures that might arise months or years after initial court proceedings. They also served as historical records that preserved the community's response to criminal behavior and the evolution of legal practice over time. Evening brought a different character to the courthouse as the day's scheduled proceedings concluded and the building settled into the quieter rhythms of evening maintenance and security patrols. Officer Rodriguez's duties during evening hours included ensuring that the building was properly secured, that sensitive documents and evidence were appropriately protected, and that the building's various systems were functioning properly. The courthouse at night had a solemnity that reflected the serious business conducted within its walls during daytime hours. The formal architecture and dignified furnishings created an atmosphere of respect for legal tradition and the rule of law, while the building's quiet suggested the peace that came from the resolution of conflicts through established legal procedures. Walking through the empty courtrooms and corridors, Officer Rodriguez often reflected on the thousands of cases that had been processed through the building during his 5 years of service. Each case had represented a moment of disruption in community life, a violation of the social agreements that made civilized existence possible, and an opportunity for the community to reaffirm its commitment to justice and order. The courthouse stood as a physical embodiment of the community's dedication to resolving conflicts through reason and established procedure rather than through violence or private revenge. Its continued operation represented the ongoing effort to maintain social order through institutions that balanced individual rights with collective security and the demands of justice with recognition of human complexity and the possibility of redemption. The building would be here tomorrow, ready to host another day of careful legal proceedings, patient deliberations, and measured decisions that would contribute to the ongoing work of maintaining justice and order in a complex world. The courthouse represented more than just a place where legal business was conducted. It was a symbol of the community's commitment to addressing human problems through rational dialogue and established procedures rather than through force or arbitrary power. Maple Street stretched 6 blocks through what residents called the heart of the Riverside neighborhood, lined with modest 2-story homes built during the 1940s for returning veterans and their young families. The trees that gave the street its name had grown tall over the decades, their branches creating a green canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight and provided natural boundaries between the public space of the street and the private worlds of individual households. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson had lived at 412 Maple Street for 38 years, occupying the same house where she and her late husband, Harold, had raised their 3 children, and where she now maintained a garden that had become a source of pride for the entire neighborhood. Her roses bloomed from early spring through late fall, and her vegetable garden provided surplus tomatoes and peppers that she shared generously with neighbors who had become extended family over the decades. The crime that had touched Mrs. Patterson's life had been small in the larger scheme of police business, but significant in the way it had disrupted the sense of security that she had carefully cultivated around her home and garden. Someone had broken into her detached garage during the night, stealing her late husband's tools and the lawnmower that she used to maintain the small front yard that was her connection to the street's community life. Detective Maria Santos had been assigned to investigate the burglary, approaching the case with the patient thoroughness that characterized her work with crimes affecting elderly residents. The tools themselves had modest monetary value, but Detective Santos understood that their loss represented something much larger for Mrs. Patterson, who was struggling to maintain her independence in a home that was becoming increasingly difficult for her to manage. Alone, the investigation had revealed patterns that extended beyond Mrs. Patterson's individual case. Similar thefts had been occurring throughout the Riverside neighborhood over several weeks, targeting detached garages and tool sheds that were often left unsecured during overnight hours. The perpetrator seemed to be familiar with the neighborhood's routines and had been selecting targets that were unlikely to be discovered until morning. Detective Santos had conducted door-to-door interviews throughout the affected area, documenting not just the immediate facts of each burglary, but the broader context of how these crimes were affecting the neighborhood's sense of community and security. Many residents, particularly elderly homeowners like Mrs. Patterson, had responded to the thefts by installing new locks, purchasing security devices, and changing daily routines that had previously reflected their trust in neighborhood safety. Mrs. Catherine Rodriguez, who lived across the street from Mrs. Patterson, had been particularly affected by the series of thefts. Her husband's workshop in their backyard garage had contained woodworking tools that he had accumulated over 40 years of carpentry work, many of them gifts from colleagues or purchases made to commemorate significant projects. The theft had taken not just functional tools, but tangible connections to a career that had provided meaning and identity for her family. The investigation had eventually led to 16-year-old Marcus Williams, who lived with his grandmother 6 blocks away in the same neighborhood where he had been committing the thefts. Marcus had been taking items not to sell for drug money, as Detective Santos had initially suspected, but to equip a workshop where he hoped to learn trades that might provide legitimate employment opportunities. Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Dorothy Williams, had been struggling to raise her grandson after his parents were killed in an automobile accident 3 years earlier. The family's financial resources had been depleted by funeral expenses and legal complications, leaving Mrs. Williams dependent on Social Security income that was insufficient to provide the educational and recreational opportunities that Marcus needed to develop productive interests and skills. Detective Santos had discovered that Marcus had been attempting to teach himself carpentry and small engine repair, using books borrowed from the public library, but had lacked access to the tools and workspace that these skills required. His thefts had been motivated not by malicious intent, but by desperate desire for opportunities that were not available through legitimate channels. The resolution of the case had required creative cooperation between Detective Santos, the affected families, and community organizations that could provide constructive alternatives to prosecution. Mrs. Patterson, despite being the first victim in the series, had been instrumental in developing a solution that addressed Marcus's needs while ensuring that stolen property was returned and that community trust was rebuilt. The neighborhood response had evolved into what residents called the Maple Street Workshop, a community space established in the basement of the local church where young people could learn practical skills under the supervision of experienced volunteers. Several of the burglary victims, including Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Rodriguez, had donated time and expertise to the program, teaching Marcus and other teenagers the proper use of tools and techniques for home maintenance and repair. Mr. Rodriguez had become Marcus's primary mentor, working with him every Saturday morning to develop carpentry skills while also providing the kind of guidance and support that Marcus had been missing since his parents' death. The relationship had evolved beyond simple skill transfer to encompass broader life lessons about responsibility, perseverance, and the satisfaction that came from productive work. The workshop program had attracted support from other community members who recognized the value of providing constructive activities for young people in the neighborhood. Local businesses had donated materials and equipment, while retired tradesmen had volunteered to teach classes in electrical work, plumbing, and automotive repair that gave teenagers practical skills, while also strengthening connections between different generations in the community. Detective Santos had documented the program's development in follow-up reports that demonstrated how creative responses to crime could address underlying social problems while also serving the traditional goals of law enforcement. Marcus had not only returned all stolen property, but had used his developing skills to perform maintenance and repair work for elderly neighbors who were struggling to keep their homes in good condition. The success of the Maple Street workshop had inspired similar programs in other neighborhoods, creating a network of community-based resources that provided alternatives to traditional responses to juvenile crime. Detective Santos had worked with community organizers and social service agencies to develop guidelines and procedures that other neighborhoods could use to establish their own skill-building programs. Mrs. Patterson's role in the program had given her a sense of purpose and community connection that had been diminishing as she aged and as long-time neighbors moved away or passed away. Teaching young people to care for plants and maintain gardens had allowed her to share knowledge and experience while also ensuring that the neighborhood's tradition of beautiful landscaping would continue into the next generation. The relationships that had developed through the workshop program had created informal support networks that benefited everyone involved. Marcus and other young participants had begun helping elderly neighbors with tasks that were becoming physically difficult, while older community members had provided transportation, tutoring, and other forms of assistance that helped young people succeed in school and develop positive goals for their futures. Dr. James Morrison, a retired professor who lived 2 blocks from Mrs. Patterson, had become involved in the program by offering tutoring services that helped participants develop the math and reading skills they needed to advance in trade programs or continue their education. His involvement had led to partnerships with the local community college that provided scholarship opportunities for program participants who wanted to pursue formal technical education. The program had also attracted the attention of local employers who were struggling to find young workers with basic technical skills and strong work ethics. Several participants had been offered part-time jobs and apprenticeship opportunities that provided income while they continued their education and skill development. Detective Santos had tracked these positive outcomes in reports that demonstrated the long-term benefits of addressing crime through community-based solutions rather than relying solely on traditional law enforcement approaches. The initial burglary case had been resolved through Marcus's acceptance of responsibility and restitution to victims, but the broader impact had been the creation of resources and relationships that continued to benefit the community years after the original crimes had been forgotten. The Riverside neighborhood had become a model for other areas of the city that were dealing with similar problems related to youth crime and community safety. The approach developed around the Maple Street workshop had been studied by criminologists and community organizers who were interested in replicating its success in other locations. Mrs. Patterson's garden had become a focal point for community gatherings and educational activities, with Marcus and other young people helping to maintain the flower beds and vegetable plots that had made her home a neighborhood landmark. The garden served as a living symbol of the community's commitment to growth, beauty, and mutual support that had emerged from the collaborative response to crime. The annual neighborhood picnic, held in the small park at the end of Maple Street, had grown to include families from throughout the Riverside area, creating opportunities for residents to maintain the personal connections that made community safety and cooperation possible. Detective Santos often attended these gatherings, not in her official capacity, but as a friend and supporter of the community initiatives that had grown out of her careful investigation of Marcus's case. Success of the workshop program had led to expansion into other activities that addressed different aspects of community life. A community garden had been established on a vacant lot, providing fresh vegetables for families, while also creating a space where people of different ages and backgrounds could work together toward common goals. Mrs. Angela Foster, a social worker who lived in the neighborhood, had organized an after-school tutoring program that operated in conjunction with the workshop, ensuring that young people had support for academic success as well as practical skill development. The program had attracted volunteer tutors from throughout the city, creating connections between the Riverside neighborhood and the broader metropolitan community. The transformation of Marcus's relationship with his neighborhood had been particularly dramatic. From a young person who had been taking property that didn't belong to him, he had become someone who was actively contributing to community welfare and serving as a positive role model for other teenagers who were facing similar challenges. Marcus's success in the workshop program had led to a full scholarship for technical education at the community college, where he was studying to become a certified electrician while continuing to volunteer with neighborhood maintenance projects. His transformation had inspired other young people to become involved in constructive activities and had demonstrated the potential for positive change when communities responded to crime with solutions rather than simply punishment. The elderly residents of Maple Street had found new purpose and energy through their involvement in community programs that had grown out of the initial response to the burglary cases. Rather than becoming increasingly isolated and fearful, they had become active participants in creating safety and opportunities for the next generation. Mr. Robert Chun, who had lived on Maple Street for 45 years, had used his experience as a retired banker to help young people in the workshop program develop financial literacy skills that would help them manage earnings from part-time jobs and plan for future educational and career goals. His involvement had created mentoring relationships that enriched his retirement years while providing practical guidance for young people. The neighborhood's response to crime had created a model for community policing that emphasized prevention through social engagement rather than simply responding to crimes after they occurred. Detective Santos had worked closely with patrol officers to ensure that their daily activities supported and reinforced the community relationships that had been developed through the workshop program. Officer Jennifer Walsh, who had been assigned to regular patrol duties in the Riverside neighborhood, had become a familiar and trusted presence, who knew most residents by name and was aware of ongoing community initiatives and concerns. Her approach to patrol work emphasized building relationships and preventing problems, rather than simply responding to emergency calls. The partnership between law enforcement and community organizations had created a comprehensive approach to neighborhood safety that addressed the social and economic factors that contributed to crime while also maintaining the visible police presence that helped residents feel secure in their homes and on their streets. The success of community-based crime prevention in the Riverside neighborhood had influenced police department policies and training programs, with Detective Santos and other officers sharing their experiences with colleagues who were working in other parts of the city. The approach had been incorporated into academy training for new officers and had become a model for community policing initiatives throughout the region. The stories of individual families who had been affected by crime and had participated in community responses had become part of the neighborhood's collective memory and identity. These stories were shared at community meetings and social gatherings, creating a narrative of resilience and cooperation that strengthened residents' commitment to working together to address challenges. The workshop program had documented its activities and outcomes in reports that were shared with other communities and with researchers who were studying effective approaches to crime prevention and community development. The program's success had attracted funding from foundations and government agencies that supported community-based solutions to social problems. As evening settled over Maple Street, the sounds of daily life created a peaceful symphony of home and community. Children playing in front yards, adults tending gardens, neighbors' conversations over backyard fences. The distant sounds of workshop activities from the church basement where Marcus and other young people were learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The neighborhood's response to crime had created something much larger than crime prevention. It had created a model for community life that emphasized mutual support, shared responsibility, and the recognition that everyone had something valuable to contribute to the common good. The success of these initiatives had demonstrated that crime could serve as a catalyst for positive social change when communities chose to respond with creativity and cooperation rather than fear, and respond with creativity and cooperation rather than fear, and correspond with pair. Isolation. Mrs. Patterson's roses continued to bloom, tended now by young hands that had learned their care from her patient teaching. The garden served as a living symbol of the community's growth and resilience, a reminder that beauty and order could flourish even after disruption, that neighborhoods could become stronger through their response to challenges, and that the bonds between people could be deepened rather than broken by the experience of working together to heal and rebuild after loss. The night shift began at 11 p.m. with the quiet ceremony of briefing, where the day's accumulated wisdom was passed to the officers who would carry the city through its sleeping hours. Sergeant Michael Chun stood before the small group of officers who had drawn overnight assignments, reviewing the day's incidents with the measured calm that characterized all his interactions with the department's most experienced personnel. The briefing room on the second floor had been renovated in the early 1990s, but it still retained the functional simplicity that police work required. Fluorescent lights provided even illumination across worn but sturdy tables where officers could spread their paperwork and take notes during the shift supervisor's review of ongoing cases and overnight priorities. A large map of the city dominated one wall, marked with colored pins that indicated areas requiring special attention during the overnight hours. Officer Patricia Rodriguez had been working night shifts for 8 years, developing an appreciation for the different character that police work took on when most of the city was asleep. The radio traffic was lighter, the calls less urgent, and there was more time for the careful, thoughtful approach to problems that often yielded better results than the rapid response that daytime emergencies required. Detective Jennifer Walsh had requested assignment to the night shift specifically because it provided uninterrupted time for the detailed investigation and paperwork that complex cases required. Her desk in the detective bureau was positioned near a window that faced west, allowing her to watch the progression of evening into night and eventually into dawn as she worked through files and reports that demanded careful attention. The station's atmosphere changed significantly after the day shift departed and the building settled into its overnight rhythms. The phones rang less frequently, the corridors were quieter, and there was a sense of peaceful focus that allowed officers to concentrate on tasks that required sustained attention. The night shift attracted officers who preferred this contemplative approach to police work, who found satisfaction in the methodical completion of investigations and reports. The dispatch center, located on the first floor of the building, maintained constant contact with patrol units throughout the city. But the overnight hours typically brought a different mix of calls than the daytime shifts handled. Domestic disturbances, noise complaints, and minor traffic violations comprised much of the night shift's work. Though these routine calls often revealed complex social problems that required patient attention and creative solutions, dispatcher Sarah Morrison had been working overnight shifts for 12 years, developing an intimate knowledge of the city's nocturnal patterns and the regular callers who contacted police during the late evening and early morning hours. Her calm professional voice had become a source of reassurance for officers working alone in patrol cars and for citizens who called during their moments of crisis or confusion. The overnight hours provided opportunities for community policing activities that were difficult to schedule during the busier day shifts. Officer David Thompson regularly visited the all-night businesses along the commercial strips that remained active during overnight hours, building relationships with store clerks, security guards, and late shift workers who served as the eyes and ears of the community during the hours when most residents were asleep. These visits were more than just security checks. They were opportunities to gather information about neighborhood conditions and to provide a visible police presence that helped business owners and employees feel safer during the vulnerable overnight hours. Officer Thompson had discovered that many crimes were prevented simply through these regular contacts that demonstrated police attention to areas that might otherwise feel isolated or neglected. The donut shop on 5th Street had become an unofficial community center for night shift workers throughout the city. Police officers, firefighters, hospital staff, and security guards gathered there during their meal breaks, creating an informal information network that helped coordinate emergency responses and maintain awareness of developing problems throughout the metropolitan area. Martha Williams had owned the 5th Street donut shop for 18 years, opening at 4 a.m. every day to serve the community of workers who kept the city functioning during overnight hours. Her shop had become a neutral ground where public safety personnel could relax briefly and share information in an informal setting that complemented their official communication channels. Officer Rodriguez often stopped at Martha's shop during the quiet hours around 2 a.m., when radio traffic was minimal and there was time for the kind of community contact that built trust and cooperation between police and residents. These conversations provided insights into neighborhood concerns and emerging problems that might not be reported through official channels, but could be addressed before they developed into more serious situations. The overnight patrol routes were designed to provide comprehensive coverage of the city while allowing officers sufficient time for thorough investigation of calls and proactive community contact. The routes were adjusted seasonally to account for changing patterns of activity and to ensure adequate coverage of areas that experienced different types of problems during overnight hours. During winter months, the overnight patrols paid particular attention to areas where homeless individuals might be seeking shelter, checking abandoned buildings and providing information about available social services for people who were struggling with housing insecurity. These welfare checks were conducted with dignity and respect, recognizing that homelessness was a social problem rather than a criminal issue. Officer Maria Santos had developed expertise in connecting homeless individuals with appropriate services, maintaining contact information for shelters, social service agencies, and mental health resources that could provide assistance to people who were living on the streets. Her approach emphasized offering help rather than enforcement, though she was prepared to take appropriate action when homeless individuals were engaged in activities that threatened public safety. The overnight hours also provided opportunities for training and professional development that were difficult to schedule during busier day shifts. Senior officers used quiet periods to mentor younger colleagues, sharing experience and wisdom that could only be gained through years of patient police work. Detective Walsh often worked with newer investigators during the night shift, teaching them the careful attention to detail and methodical approach that effective case investigation required. These training sessions took place in the quiet of the detective bureau, where there were fewer interruptions and more time for the kind of thorough discussion that helped young officers develop the skills they would need throughout their careers. The evidence room, located in the basement of the station, required regular overnight maintenance and inventory checks that ensured the security and integrity of materials that might be needed for court proceedings. Evidence technician Robert Chun worked the night shift specifically to perform these crucial but time-consuming tasks that helped maintain the chain of custody that made prosecution possible. The evidence room contained thousands of items collected from crime scenes over many years, each one carefully cataloged and preserved according to strict protocols that ensured its admissibility in court. The overnight hours provided the quiet time necessary for the detailed record keeping and physical maintenance that this responsibility required. Many of the items in the evidence room represented cases that had been resolved years earlier but required continued preservation in case of appeals or other legal proceedings. Evidence technician Chun took pride in maintaining these materials with the same care that had been applied when they were first collected, understanding that his work was essential to the integrity of the entire criminal justice system. The overnight shift often dealt with calls that required more social work skills than traditional law enforcement training provided. Officers regularly encountered individuals who were experiencing mental health crises, substance abuse problems, or family difficulties that demanded patient intervention and creative problem solving rather than arrest and prosecution. Officer Thompson had developed relationships with mental health professionals and social service agencies that allowed him to connect people in crisis with appropriate help rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system. These contacts had been built through years of night shift work and represented the kind of community partnerships that made effective policing possible. The night shift also provided opportunities for the detailed follow-up investigation that many cases required, but that was difficult to complete during the busier day shifts. Detectives used the quiet overnight hours to conduct phone interviews with witnesses, review evidence, and prepare reports that would move cases toward resolution. Detective Walsh had solved several complex cases through the patient work that the night shift allowed, conducting detailed analysis of evidence and witness statements that revealed patterns and connections that had not been apparent during the initial investigation. Her success had demonstrated the value of having investigative time that was protected from the constant interruptions that characterized daytime police work. The night shift briefing room served as an informal classroom where officers shared experiences and discussed approaches to the various challenges they encountered. These discussions were valuable professional development opportunities that helped officers learn from each other's experience and develop new strategies for addressing community problems. Sergeant Chun encouraged these discussions as part of his management approach, recognizing that the collective wisdom of experienced officers was one of the department's most valuable resources. The night shift's smaller size and more relaxed atmosphere created opportunities for the kind of open dialogue that helped officers learn and grow throughout their careers. The station's communications equipment required regular, overnight maintenance that ensured reliable contact with patrol units and other emergency services throughout the metropolitan area. Communications technician Lisa Rodriguez worked the night shift to perform these essential tasks during hours when radio traffic was lighter and maintenance work would cause minimal disruption to operations. The reliability of police communications was essential to officer safety and effective emergency response, making the overnight maintenance work that Lisa performed a crucial but often unrecognized contribution to public safety. Her technical expertise ensured that officers could maintain contact with supervisors and colleagues, even in the most challenging circumstances. The overnight hours provided opportunities for the kind of detailed case review and analysis that helped identify patterns and trends that might indicate emerging problems or opportunities for prevention. Detective Walsh regularly used night shift time to review closed cases, looking for lessons that might improve future investigations or prevent similar crimes. This analytical work had led to insights about crime, patterns, and prevention strategies that had improved the department's overall effectiveness. The night shift's quieter atmosphere provided the focused time necessary for the kind of careful analysis that produced actionable intelligence about criminal activity and community problems. The community policing philosophy that guided the department's approach emphasized building relationships and preventing problems, rather than simply responding to crimes after they occurred. The night shift provided unique opportunities for this kind of proactive work, allowing officers to identify and address problems before they escalated into more serious situations. Officer Rodriguez had prevented numerous crimes through her patient work with business owners, residents, and community organizations that created informal surveillance networks and early warning systems for emerging problems. Her success had demonstrated that effective crime prevention required ongoing community engagement rather than reactive enforcement. The night shift's work was documented in reports and briefings that provided valuable information for day shift officers and department administrators who needed to understand overnight developments and their implications for broader police operations. This documentation served as a bridge between shifts that ensured continuity of service and comprehensive coverage of community needs. The quiet hours of the night shift provided time for reflection on the broader purposes and methods of police work, allowing officers to consider their role in maintaining community safety and social order. These reflective periods were valuable opportunities for professional growth and personal development that helped officers maintain perspective and motivation throughout their careers. As dawn approached, the night shift began preparing for the transition to day shift operations, completing reports, securing evidence, and briefing their colleagues about overnight developments that would require continued attention. This transition was handled with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all night shift work, ensuring that important information was preserved and communicated effectively. The night shift's contribution to community safety extended far beyond the calls they answered and the arrests they made. Their patient work in building relationships, preventing problems, and maintaining the infrastructure of law enforcement created the foundation that made effective policing possible during all hours of the day and night. The quiet dedication of night shift officers represented the best traditions of police service, demonstrating that effective law enforcement required not dramatic action but sustained commitment to the careful work of maintaining order and safety in communities that depended on their vigilance and professionalism. The photography lab in the basement of the police station had been the domain of technical specialist Robert Morrison for the past 23 years, a quiet workspace where the visual evidence of countless cases had been developed, printed, and preserved for investigation and prosecution. The lab retained much of its original equipment from the 1970s, when film photography was the standard. For crime scene documentation and digital imaging was still a distant technological possibility. Morrison had witnessed the gradual transition from black and white to color photography, from manual processing to automated development. But the essential nature of his work remained unchanged, capturing and preserving visual evidence that could tell stories when witnesses were unavailable, and documenting scenes in ways that allowed investigators to return again and again to examine details that might have been missed during initial investigations. The filing cabinets that lined One wall of the lab contained hundreds of thousands of photographs, from cases dating back to the 1960s, each image carefully labeled with case numbers, dates, and brief descriptions that allowed future researchers to locate specific materials quickly and efficiently. These photographs represented a visual history of crime and investigation in the city, documenting changes in criminal methods, investigative techniques, and the urban landscape itself. On this particular afternoon, Morrison was working through a batch of old files that had been requested for a cold case review, carefully examining photographs that had been taken 15 years earlier during the investigation of a residential burglary that had never been completely resolved. The images showed rooms disturbed by the intruder's search for valuables, furniture displaced in ways that suggested either haste or frustration, and the careful documentation of evidence that had been collected but had never led to an arrest. The photographs from the Patterson House burglary, case number 92 to 847, had been taken with the methodical precision that characterized all crime scene photography. Each room had been photographed from multiple angles, showing both overview shots that captured the general condition of the space and detailed close-ups of specific areas where evidence had been collected or damage had occurred. Morrison remembered taking these photographs, recalled the careful attention to lighting and composition that ensured all relevant details were clearly visible, and that the images would reproduce well when presented to juries or included in investigative reports. Crime scene photography required technical skill, but also, and crime scene photography required technical skill, but also an understanding of what investigators would need to see and what prosecutors would need to demonstrate in court. The living room photographs showed furniture that had been carefully searched, rather than randomly disturbed, suggesting an intruder who was looking for specific items rather than simply taking whatever was easily accessible. Books had been removed from shelves and stacked neatly on tables. Cushions had been lifted and replaced, and drawers had been opened and their contents examined without being scattered across the floor. Detective Maria Santos had been the investigating officer on the Patterson case, and her evidence notes were filed alongside Morrison's photographs, creating a comprehensive record of the crime scene that could be reviewed and analyzed years after the initial investigation. Santos had documented the selective nature of the theft, noting that expensive electronics had been ignored while smaller, more personal items had been taken. The bedroom photographs revealed the same pattern of careful searching. Mrs. Patterson's jewelry box had been emptied, but only certain pieces had been taken, leaving behind items that would have been more valuable to a typical burglar. Family photographs had been removed from their frames, which were left behind, and personal documents had been searched through but not taken or destroyed. Morrison had photographed each piece of evidence in its original location before it was collected, creating a permanent record of the crime scene's condition that could be consulted long after the physical evidence had been processed and stored. These in situ photographs were often crucial for reconstruction of events and for understanding the relationship between different pieces of evidence. The bathroom and kitchen photographs showed areas that had been searched but not disturbed, confirming the pattern of selective investigation that had characterized the entire crime scene. The intruder had been looking for something specific, had known where such items might be kept, and had been willing to spend considerable time searching for materials that would not have interested a typical burglar. Detective Santos's investigation had eventually revealed that Mrs. Patterson had been the victim of identity theft as well as burglary. The careful search of personal documents and family photographs had been conducted by someone who was gathering information for financial fraud rather than simply looking for items to steal and resell. Morrison's photographs had played a crucial role in identifying this pattern, providing visual evidence of the systematic search that had been conducted and supporting Detective Santos's theory about the intruder's true motives. The images had been presented to federal investigators, who were working on a larger identity theft case that eventually included Mrs. Patterson's situation. The resolution of the case had come 18 months after the burglary, when federal agents arrested a sophisticated identity theft ring that had been operating throughout the region. Morrison's crime scene photographs had been part of the evidence package that helped prosecutors demonstrate the organized nature of the criminal enterprise and the careful planning that had gone into each individual theft. Mrs. Patterson's photographs and personal documents had been recovered during the federal investigation, though by then the financial damage from identity theft had been significant. The case had demonstrated the importance of thorough crime scene documentation that could reveal patterns and connections that might not be apparent during initial investigations. Morrison had continued to follow developments in the case through court proceedings and appeals, understanding that his photographic work was part of a larger process of investigation and prosecution that could continue for years after the initial crime. The careful documentation he provided often proved crucial during trials, when prosecutors needed to recreate crime scenes for juries and defense attorneys challenged the methods and conclusions of police investigations. The cold case review that had prompted Morrison to retrieve the Patterson photographs had been initiated when investigators noticed similarities between that case and several recent burglaries that had occurred in upscale neighborhoods. The same pattern of selective searching and document theft had appeared in new cases, suggesting that either the original perpetrators had resumed their activities or that someone was using similar methods. Comparing the old photographs with images from recent crime scenes, Morrison could see clear similarities in the methods used and the types of items targeted. The careful, systematic search patterns were virtually identical, and the focus on personal documents and identity information rather than valuable electronics or jewelry was consistent across cases. Separated by more than a decade, Detective Walsh had requested the photographic comparison as part of her investigation into the recent cases, recognizing that visual evidence could reveal connections that might not be apparent from written reports alone. Morrison's expertise in analyzing crime scene photographs had proven valuable in identifying patterns and techniques that linked apparently unrelated crimes. The photography lab's archives contained similar treasures of investigative history, case files where Morrison's careful documentation had preserved crucial evidence that had helped solve crimes, convict perpetrators, and provide closure for victims and their families. Each photograph represented a moment in time when disorder had disrupted someone's life, but also a step in the process of restoring order and seeking justice. Morrison had photographed hundreds of crime scenes over his career, documenting everything from minor vandalism to major felonies, always with the same attention to technical excellence and investigative thoroughness. His work had supported successful prosecutions, had provided crucial evidence in appeals, and had helped cold case investigators solve crimes that had remained open for years. The equipment in the lab had evolved significantly over Morrison's career, from the large format cameras and manual processing equipment of the 1970s to the sophisticated digital imaging systems that characterized contemporary crime scene photography. But the fundamental principles of his work remained unchanged: accurate documentation, careful preservation, and comprehensive coverage that ensured no important detail was missed or lost. Morrison took particular pride in the technical quality of his photographs, understanding that images needed to be sharp, properly exposed, and correctly composed to serve their intended purposes in investigation and prosecution. Poor photography could compromise entire cases, while excellent documentation could provide the foundation for successful resolution of even complex crimes. The filing system Morrison had developed over his career allowed quick access to photographs from thousands of cases, with cross-references that linked related investigations and helped investigators identify patterns that might span multiple jurisdictions or extend across many years. His organizational skills had proven as valuable as his technical expertise in supporting the department's investigative efforts. Many of Morrison's photographs have been used in training programs for new investigators, providing examples of proper crime scene documentation and illustrating investigative techniques that had proven successful in actual cases. His work had helped establish standards and procedures that were now used throughout the department and had been adopted by other agencies seeking to improve their crime scene photography capabilities. The lab's archives also contained photographs that had been taken for community policing and public relations purposes, documenting positive interactions between police and residents and showing the department's involvement in community events and educational programs. These images provided a different perspective on police work, showing officers engaged in prevention and community building rather than just enforcement and investigation. Morrison had photographed dozens of community events over the years, from neighborhood watch meetings to youth programs to celebrations of successful crime prevention initiatives. These photographs documented the positive relationships that effective policing required and showed the human side of law enforcement that was often overshadowed by coverage of more dramatic incidents. The portrait photographs in Morrison's files included images of officers who had served with distinction, retiring personnel who had contributed significantly to the department's mission, and community members who had been honored for their cooperation with police efforts. These photographs preserved the institutional memory of the department and recognized the contributions of individuals who had helped make effective policing possible. Detective Santos appeared in several of these portrait photographs, images taken during award ceremonies and community events that documented her successful career and her contributions to both law enforcement and community safety. Her work on the Patterson identity theft case had been representative of the careful, thorough approach that had characterized her entire career. Morrison had also photographed evidence from hundreds of cases that had been successfully prosecuted, documenting weapons, stolen property, drugs, and other materials that had been used to convict criminals and protect communities. These evidence photographs had been crucial in court proceedings and had helped prosecutors present clear, convincing cases to juries. The weapon photographs in Morrison's files showed the careful documentation, techniques that ensured accurate representation of evidence while also maintaining chain of custody, requirements that made materials admissible in court. Each weapon was photographed from multiple angles with rulers or other measurement devices that provided accurate size references, and with identification tags that linked the images to specific cases and suspects. Drug evidence photographs required particular attention to quantity and packaging, providing visual documentation that supported charges and helped prosecutors demonstrate the scale and sophistication of criminal enterprises. Morrison's photographs had been used in numerous federal cases where local drug arrests had been part of larger investigations into distribution networks that spanned multiple jurisdictions. Stolen property photographs served multiple purposes, providing evidence for prosecution while also helping identify items that could be returned to victims. Morrison had developed techniques for photographing jewelry, electronics, and other valuables that captured distinctive features and markings that allowed positive identification even when property had been altered or damaged during criminal activities. The vehicle photographs in Morrison's files documented crime scenes involving automobiles, from routine traffic incidents to complex investigations involving stolen cars, hit-and-run accidents, and crimes where vehicles had been used as weapons or had contained evidence crucial to prosecution. These photographs often required specialized techniques for capturing details in challenging lighting conditions and confined spaces. Morrison had photographed numerous accident reconstruction scenes where precise documentation of vehicle positions, damage patterns, and physical evidence had been crucial for determining fault and supporting insurance claims or criminal charges. His technical expertise had been particularly valuable in cases where expert witnesses needed accurate, visual materials to support their testimony. The seasonal changes visible in Morrison's photographs provided an unexpected record of how the city had evolved over his career, showing neighborhoods as they had developed, buildings that had been constructed or demolished, and landscapes that had been altered by both natural growth and urban development. These background details often proved valuable in dating photographs and establishing timelines for investigations. Winter crime scene photographs presented particular technical challenges, with snow and ice affecting both lighting conditions and evidence preservation. Morrison had developed specialized techniques for photographing outdoor scenes in winter conditions, ensuring that crucial evidence was documented before weather conditions could compromise its integrity. The summer photographs in Morrison's files often showed crime scenes in residential neighborhoods where community activities and outdoor gatherings created complex environments for investigation. These images documented the social context of crimes and helped investigators understand how community dynamics might have influenced both criminal behavior and witness availability. As evening approached and Morrison completed his review of the Patterson case photographs, he reflected on the thousands of images he had created over his career and their role in the larger process of investigation and justice. Each photograph represented a moment when someone's life had been disrupted by crime, but also a step toward restoration and resolution. The careful preservation of these photographs in the department's archives ensured that the visual evidence they contained would remain available for future investigations, appeals, and historical research. Morrison's work had created a permanent record of crime and investigation that would serve the cause of justice long after his own retirement. The old stone bridge that crossed Miller Creek had stood since 1923, its granite blocks weathered by decades of rain and snow but still solid beneath. The feet of pedestrians who used it daily to connect the residential neighborhoods on the creek's north side with the commercial district to the south. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun often walked across this bridge during her evening patrols, not because any particular crimes had occurred there, but because the bridge served as a vantage point from which she could observe the rhythms of community life that formed the backdrop against which all police work took place. The bridge had witnessed 3 generations of the city's evolution, from the industrial community of the 1920s through the suburban expansion of the post-war decades to the contemporary mix of gentrification and preservation that characterized modern urban development. Each era had left its mark on the surrounding neighborhoods, creating layers of architectural and social history that provided context for understanding how crime patterns had evolved over the decades. During the 1940s and 1950s, the area around Miller Creek had been home to working class families employed in the foundries and manufacturing plants that provided the economic foundation for the community. Crime in that era had typically involved disputes between neighbors, occasional domestic disturbances, and the petty theft that reflected economic hardship rather than organized criminal activity. Detective Chun had studied the old police reports from that period, finding descriptions of a community where most residents knew each other by name and where social pressure served as a primary mechanism for maintaining order and resolving disputes before they required formal police intervention. Officers walked regular beats through neighborhoods, building relationships with families and business owners that created informal networks of communication and cooperation. The creek itself had played a role in several investigations over the decades, though rarely as the scene of serious crimes. More often, it had served as a boundary that helped define territories and jurisdictions. a natural landmark that appeared in witness statements and crime scene descriptions, and occasionally as a location where evidence had been discarded by perpetrators who hoped that running water would eliminate traces of their activities. In the summer of 1967, a series of minor vandalism incidents had occurred along the walking path that followed the creek's north bank, with someone spray painting abstract designs on the concrete retaining walls that protected the path from periodic flooding. The investigating officer, Patrolman Robert Morrison, had approached the case not as simple property destruction but as an opportunity to understand the social dynamics that might be creating destructive behavior among local teenagers. Morrison's investigation had revealed that the vandalism was being committed by a group of high school students who were protesting what they saw as the community's lack of recreational facilities for young people. The walking path had been recently constructed as part of a flood control project, but no provisions had been made for basketball courts, skateboard areas, or other facilities that would have given teenagers constructive outlets for their energy and creativity. Rather than simply arresting the vandals, Morrison had worked with community leaders to address the underlying issues that had motivated the destructive behavior. The resolution had involved the creation of a supervised after-school program that met in the basement of the nearby community center, giving young people access to art supplies and instruction that allowed them to channel their creative impulses in positive directions. The community center, a brick building constructed in 1955, had become a focal point for crime prevention efforts that emphasized providing alternatives to destructive behavior rather than simply punishing violations after they occurred. Over the decades, the center had hosted job training programs, senior citizen activities, youth sports leagues, and community meetings that brought residents together to address shared concerns and coordinate responses to neighborhood problems. Detective Chen often visited the community center during her patrols, not to investigate specific incidents, but to maintain the relationships with community leaders and program participants that made effective policing possible. These informal contacts provided early warning about emerging problems and created opportunities for intervention before conflicts escalated into situations that required formal law enforcement response. The neighborhood surrounding the community center had experienced significant demographic changes during the 1980s and 1990s, as urban renewal projects had displaced some longtime residents while attracting new families seeking affordable housing close to downtown employment centers. These changes had created both opportunities and challenges for community policing efforts. The Miller Creek Apartments, a complex of two-story buildings constructed in the early 1980s, had initially been designed to provide transitional housing for families who were working toward homeownership but needed temporary accommodation during their search for permanent housing. Over time, the complex had evolved into more permanent housing for residents who appreciated the location and the sense of community that had developed among neighbors. Detective Chen had investigated several cases in the Miller Creek Apartments over the years, typically involving disputes between residents or minor property crimes that reflected the stress and uncertainty that often accompanied urban life. Her approach emphasized mediation and problem solving rather than arrest and prosecution, recognizing that many conflicts could be resolved through improved communication and mutual understanding. The apartment complex had developed its own informal security network, with longtime residents keeping watch over common areas and alerting management to problems before they required police intervention. This resident-led approach had proven effective in maintaining safety while preserving the community atmosphere that made the complex attractive to families with children and elderly residents who valued social connection. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson had lived in Building C of the Miller Creek Apartments for 8 years, serving as an informal coordinator for community activities and a resource for new residents who needed assistance, navigating city services and social programs. Her apartment overlooked the small playground that had been installed in the complex's central courtyard, giving her a natural vantage point for observing activities and ensuring that children played safely. When Detective Chun had been called to investigate reports of suspicious activity in the complex's parking area, Mrs. Patterson had been able to provide detailed observations about unusual vehicles and unfamiliar individuals who had been seen in the area during previous weeks. Her information had been crucial in identifying a pattern of auto thefts that had been occurring throughout the neighborhood. The investigation had revealed that car thieves had been targeting the Miller Creek apartments because the parking area was partially hidden from street view and because residents often worked shifts that left vehicles unattended for extended periods. The thieves had been professional operators who used sophisticated methods to defeat anti-theft systems and who removed vehicles quickly to avoid detection. Detective Chun's investigation had led to cooperation with neighboring police departments, as the stolen vehicles were typically transported out of the immediate area within hours of theft. This regional approach had eventually resulted in the arrest of an organized auto theft ring that had been operating throughout the metropolitan area. The resolution of the auto theft case had led to improved lighting and security measures in the Miller Creek Apartments parking area, funded through a combination of apartment management resources and a community safety grant that the city had obtained specifically for crime prevention improvements. The collaborative approach had strengthened relationships between residents, management, and police while reducing opportunities for future theft. Commercial district across Miller Creek Bridge had its own history of crime and community response that reflected the changing economic conditions that had affected the area over several decades. The main street that ran through the district had once been lined with small businesses that served the surrounding residential neighborhoods, creating a pedestrian-friendly environment where business owners knew their customers personally, and where informal surveillance helped maintain security during the economic difficulties of the 1970s and 1980s. Several businesses had closed, leaving empty storefronts that had occasionally attracted vandalism and other minor criminal activities. Rather than simply responding to these incidents as they occurred, the police department had worked with remaining business owners and community organizations to develop comprehensive strategies for revitalizing the commercial area. The Miller Creek Business Association had been formed in 1985 as a collaborative effort between business owners, community leaders, and city officials who recognized that economic development and crime prevention were interconnected goals that required coordinated action. The association had focused on attracting new businesses, improving the physical appearance of the district, and creating events that would draw residents to the area during evening and weekend hours. Detective Chun had worked closely with the Business Association throughout her career, understanding that the commercial district's success was crucial for the economic health of surrounding neighborhoods and for providing legitimate employment opportunities for residents who might otherwise be attracted to criminal activities. Her patrol schedule included regular visits to businesses during opening and closing hours, when owners were most vulnerable to robbery and when her visible presence could deter criminal activity. The annual Miller Creek Festival, held each September in the small park adjacent to the stone bridge, had become a symbol of the community's resilience and its commitment to positive social interaction. The festival had been initiated in 1988 as a crime prevention initiative, bringing residents together for food, music, and games that strengthened social bonds, while creating opportunities for police officers to interact with community members in a relaxed, non-enforcement setting. Detective Chun had participated in every Miller Creek festival since joining the department, working with volunteers to coordinate security and traffic management while also serving as a resource for residents who had questions or concerns about neighborhood safety. The festival had grown substantially over the years, attracting visitors from throughout the metropolitan area and generating revenue that supported year-round crime prevention programs. The success of community events like the Miller Creek Festival had demonstrated the effectiveness of approaches that emphasized positive social interaction rather than simply enforcement and punishment. Detective Chun had observed that neighborhoods with strong social networks and regular community activities experienced significantly lower crime rates than areas where residents remained isolated from each other. The elementary school, located 6 blocks north of the bridge, had been a focal point for many community policing initiatives that recognized the connection between educational success and crime prevention. Detective Chun had worked with school administrators and teachers to develop programs that taught children about safety, while also creating positive relationships between young people and law enforcement personnel. The school's after-school program had been expanded to include components that addressed conflict resolution, decision-making skills, and the development of positive social relationships that could provide alternatives to involvement with criminal activities. These programs had been particularly effective in reaching children who were at risk due to family instability or economic hardship. Officer Maria Santos had been assigned as the community liaison to Miller Creek Elementary School, developing expertise in working with children and families who were dealing with various forms of social stress and instability. Her approach emphasized providing resources and support rather than punishment, recognizing that early intervention could prevent problems that might otherwise lead to involvement with the juvenile justice system. The walking path along Miller Creek had been extended during the late 1990s as part of a comprehensive urban development plan that included flood control improvements, recreational enhancements, and habitat restoration that made the creek corridor more attractive for both human use and wildlife preservation. The path had become popular with joggers, dog walkers, and families seeking outdoor recreation close to their homes. Detective Chun often used the walking path during her patrols, finding that the elevated perspective it provided allowed her to observe activities in the surrounding neighborhoods while also giving her opportunities for informal contact with residents who used the path for exercise and recreation. These casual interactions had proven valuable for gathering information about community conditions and emerging problems. The path had occasionally been the site of minor crimes, typically involving bicycle thefts or purse snatchings that occurred when perpetrators targeted isolated pedestrians during early morning or evening hours. Detective Chun had worked with the city's Parks Department to improve lighting and sightlines along the path while also organizing volunteer patrols that increased the likelihood that criminal activities would be observed and reported. The volunteer patrol program had attracted participants from throughout the Miller Creek neighborhood, creating a network of residents who were trained in observation techniques and communication procedures that allowed them to serve as additional eyes and ears for formal law enforcement. The program had proven effective not only for crime prevention, but also for building social connections among neighbors who shared concerns about community safety. As Detective Chun walked across the stone bridge on this particular evening, she reflected on the accumulated history of crime and community response that the area represented. The bridge itself had become a symbol of connection and continuity, linking not just the physical spaces on either side of Miller Creek, but also the past and present of a community that had learned to address its problems through cooperation and mutual support. The evening light reflected off the creek's surface, creating patterns that shifted with the gentle current that carried away the remnants of each day's activities. The sound of water moving over rocks provided a peaceful soundtrack, that seemed to wash away the urgency and tension that often characterized police work, replacing them with a sense of perspective and renewal that prepared officers for the challenges of another day. The neighborhoods visible from the bridge showed signs of the ongoing life that characterized healthy communities, children playing in yards, adults tending gardens, elderly residents sitting on porches, teenagers gathering at the community center. These scenes of ordinary life represented the ultimate success of crime prevention efforts, the creation and maintenance of social environments where people could pursue their daily activities without fear or disruption. Detective Chen understood that her work was ultimately about preserving and protecting these ordinary moments of community life, ensuring that families could raise their children, that elderly residents could age with dignity, that young people could develop their potential, and that all community members could participate in the social and economic activities that made urban life rewarding and fulfilling. The stone bridge continued its patient service to the community, carrying pedestrians safely across Miller Creek while serving as a vantage point from which to observe the slow, steady work of building and maintaining the social connections that made effective crime prevention possible. The bridge had witnessed decades of change, but its fundamental purpose remained constant, providing a reliable connection between communities that shared common interests in safety, prosperity, and social harmony. The final filing cabinet in the deepest section of the archive bore a simple, brass nameplate that read "Closed Cases, Permanent Storage." Records Supervisor. Margaret Hoffman approached this cabinet with the ceremonial care she reserved for the most significant moments in her 27 years of archival service. Today marked the formal closure and permanent filing of the Morrison family case, a complex investigation that had stretched across 18 months and had involved multiple agencies in its resolution. The Morrison case had begun as a simple missing person report when 17-year-old David Morrison had failed to return home from his part-time job at the local grocery store. What had followed was an investigation that had revealed layers of family complexity, social service failures, and ultimately, human resilience that had transformed not just the Morrison family, but the entire approach that the department took to cases involving at-risk youth. Detective Jennifer Walsh had been the lead investigator on the Morrison case, bringing to it the patient thoroughness that had characterized her 15-year career in the juvenile division. Her final report, now ready for permanent filing, represented hundreds of hours of investigation, dozens of interviews, and the careful coordination of resources from throughout the community that had made the case's positive resolution possible. David Morrison had not been the victim of abduction or violence, as his family had initially feared. Instead, he had been struggling with the overwhelming pressure of family expectations, academic demands, and social difficulties that had made his daily life feel unbearable. His disappearance had been a desperate attempt to escape circumstances that he felt incapable of changing through conventional means. Detective Walsh had found David 3 weeks after his disappearance, living in a makeshift shelter in the woods behind the industrial park, surviving on food he had been taking from restaurant dumpsters and occasional odd jobs that he had been able to find among the community of homeless individuals who gathered in that area. His physical condition had been poor but not dangerous, and his mental state had reflected relief at being found rather than fear of the consequences he might face. Asterisk. The investigation had revealed that David's family situation was far more complex than anyone had initially understood. His parents, struggling with their own financial and personal difficulties, had been placing unrealistic expectations on their son while failing to recognize the signs of depression and anxiety that had been building for months before his disappearance. Margaret opened the thick folder that contained Detective Walsh's comprehensive case file, noting the careful organization that made the complex investigation accessible to future researchers who might need to understand the methods and approaches that had led to successful resolution. The file began with the initial missing person report and progressed through each stage of the investigation, documenting not just the search for David, but the broader social intervention that had addressed the underlying problems affecting his family. The family counseling that had been arranged as part of David's return home had continued for more than a year, helping all family members develop better communication skills and more realistic expectations about academic achievement and career planning. Social worker Patricia Chun had worked closely with Detective Walsh to ensure that the family received appropriate support services, while also monitoring David's adjustment and well-being. David's case had become a model for the department's approach to missing person investigations involving teenagers, demonstrating the importance of looking beyond immediate family circumstances to understand the broader social and economic pressures that could drive young people to desperate actions. The protocols developed during David's investigation had been adopted department-wide and had been shared with other agencies dealing with similar cases. Margaret turned to the section of the file that contained follow-up reports documenting David's progress. In the years following his return home, he had completed high school with the support of tutoring services and modified academic expectations that recognized his learning differences. He had gone on to enroll in a community college program that prepared students for careers in environmental conservation, reflecting his positive experience with outdoor life during his time living in the woods. The final report in David's file had been written by Detective Walsh 6 months earlier, documenting her contact with David on his 21st birthday. He had graduated from the community college program with honors and had been hired by the State Parks Department as a junior naturalist, beginning a career that combined his love of outdoor environments with his desire to help other people appreciate and protect natural resources. David's transformation from a desperate runaway to a successful young professional represented more than just individual resilience. It demonstrated the effectiveness of comprehensive intervention that addressed underlying problems rather than simply responding to immediate crises. His case had influenced training programs for police officers, social workers, and family counselors throughout the region. Margaret placed David's file in its designated position within the permanent storage system, ensuring that the lessons learned from his case would remain available for future training and research. The careful preservation of successful case studies was an essential part of the institutional memory that allowed law enforcement and social service agencies to continue improving their approaches to complex human problems. The adjacent filing section contained cases that had reached resolution through the specialized domestic violence intervention program that had been developed during the mid-1990s. These cases represented a fundamental shift in how the department approached family conflicts, moving from simple law enforcement response to comprehensive intervention that included counseling, legal advocacy, and long-term support for victims and their families. The Henderson family case, filed under permanent closure 3 years earlier, exemplified the success of this comprehensive approach. Maria Henderson had been trapped in an abusive relationship for 8 years, unable to leave due to financial dependence and fear for her children's safety. The intervention that had finally broken this cycle had required coordination between police, social services, legal advocates, and community organizations that had provided the resources and support necessary for Maria to establish an independent life. Detective Robert Morrison had been the primary investigator for the Henderson case, but the successful resolution had involved dozens of professionals working together to address every aspect of Maria's situation. Housing assistance had been arranged through a nonprofit organization that specialized in helping domestic violence victims establish safe, independent homes. Legal advocacy had been provided through a pro bono program that helped Maria navigate divorce proceedings and obtain protective orders that ensured her ex-husband could not interfere with her new life. The children's needs had been addressed through counseling services that helped them process their traumatic experiences, while also providing educational support that ensured their academic progress was not compromised by the family's difficulties. After-school programs and summer camps had provided safe, supervised activities that gave Maria opportunities to work and attend school while knowing her children were well cared for. Margaret reviewed the follow-up reports that documented the Henderson family's progress over the 5 years following their escape from domestic violence. Maria had completed a nursing degree and had found employment at the local hospital, achieving financial independence while also pursuing work that gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment. Her children had shown remarkable resilience, succeeding academically and socially despite their early traumatic experiences. The Henderson case had become a training model for domestic violence intervention, demonstrating that successful outcomes required sustained commitment and comprehensive resources rather than short-term crisis response. The protocols developed during Maria's case had been implemented throughout the department and had influenced state legislation that improved funding and coordination for domestic violence services. In the section reserved for cases involving elder abuse and neglect, Margaret found the completed file for the Watson case, which had been resolved 2 years earlier through an innovative approach that had protected a vulnerable elderly man while preserving his dignity and independence. Harold Watson, 83 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been the victim of financial exploitation by his adult son, who had been using his father's Social Security income to support his own gambling addiction. Detective Patricia Rodriguez had discovered the abuse during a routine welfare check, noticing that Mr. Watson's living conditions had deteriorated significantly and that he appeared to be malnourished despite having adequate financial resources. The investigation had revealed that his son had been taking most of his father's monthly income while providing minimal support for food, utilities, and medical care. The resolution of the Watson case had involved careful coordination between adult protective services, geriatric mental health specialists, and community organizations that provided support for elderly residents. Rather than simply removing Mr. Watson from his son's custody, the intervention team had developed a comprehensive plan that allowed him to remain in his own home while ensuring that his financial resources were protected and that he received appropriate care and supervision. A professional guardian had been appointed to manage Mr. Watson's financial affairs, while a home care service had been arranged to provide daily assistance with meals, medication, and household tasks. His son had been required to attend treatment for gambling addiction and had been prohibited from accessing his father's financial accounts. But the family relationship had been preserved through supervised visits that allowed them to maintain emotional connection. The Watson case had influenced the development of elder abuse protocols that emphasized preserving family relationships whenever possible while ensuring that vulnerable adults received necessary protection and care. The approach had proven more effective than simply removing victims from family situations, as it addressed underlying problems while maintaining the social connections that were important for elderly people's emotional well-being. Margaret turned to a section of the archive that contained cases involving white-collar crime and financial fraud, investigations that had required specialized expertise and often months or years of careful analysis to resolve. The Riverside investment case, permanently filed 6 months earlier, had been one of the largest financial fraud investigations in the department's history, involving millions of dollars in stolen pension funds and affecting hundreds of victims throughout the region. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun had led the Riverside investigation, coordinating with federal agencies and financial experts to uncover a sophisticated scheme that had been operating for more than 5 years. The case had required extensive analysis of financial records, computer files, and business transactions that had been deliberately obscured through complex accounting manipulations and shell company arrangements. The investigation had eventually led to the arrest and conviction of 3 individuals who had been systematically stealing from pension funds while creating false documentation that had hidden their activities from both victims and regulatory authorities. The stolen funds had been recovered through asset forfeiture proceedings, and the victims had received substantial restitution that had helped restore their financial security. The Riverside case had led to improved oversight procedures for financial institutions and had influenced state legislation that strengthened protections for pension fund participants. Detective Chun's investigation had been recognized by federal authorities as a model for interagency cooperation in complex financial crime cases. Margaret reviewed the section of the archive devoted to cases that had been resolved through the restorative justice program that had been implemented 5 years earlier. These cases represented a fundamental shift in how the criminal justice system approached certain types of crimes, focusing on healing and accountability rather than simply punishment. The Williams burglary case had been one of the first to be processed through the restorative justice program, bringing together the teenage perpetrator, his victim, and community members to develop a response that addressed the harm that had been caused while also providing opportunities for learning and growth. Rather than simply sending the young man to juvenile detention, the process had resulted in community service, restitution, and ongoing mentoring that had helped him develop positive goals and relationships. The victim in the Williams case, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, had been initially skeptical about the restorative justice process, but had eventually become one of its strongest advocates after experiencing the healing that had come from direct dialogue with the young man who had burglarized her home. Her willingness to participate in his rehabilitation had demonstrated the power of forgiveness and community support to transform both victims and offenders. The restorative justice program had been expanded to include various types of cases, from vandalism and theft to more serious offenses where victims were willing to participate in face-to-face meetings with perpetrators. The program had achieved remarkable success in reducing recidivism, while also providing healing opportunities for crime victims who chose to participate. In the final section of the permanent storage area, Margaret found cases that had been closed not through arrest and prosecution, but through community intervention and prevention, programs that had addressed underlying social problems before they could result in criminal behavior. These cases represented the most successful form of police work, preventing crimes rather than simply responding to them after they had occurred. The Miller Creek Community Initiative, documented in a thick file that had been closed just last month, had transformed an entire neighborhood through coordinated efforts that had addressed unemployment, family instability, and lack of recreational opportunities that had been contributing to juvenile crime and social disorder. The 3-year initiative had involved police, social services, educational institutions, and community organizations working together to create comprehensive solutions. The results of the Miller Creek Initiative had exceeded all expectations, with juvenile crime rates declining by 70% and adult unemployment falling by more than half. New businesses had been attracted to the area, property values had increased, and community surveys had shown dramatic improvements in residents' sense of safety and social connection. Detective Maria Santos had been the police coordinator for the Miller Creek Initiative, working closely with community leaders to identify problems and develop solutions that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. Her final report documented not just the statistical improvements that had been achieved, but the human stories of families whose lives had been transformed through the comprehensive support and opportunities that the initiative had provided. As Margaret completed the filing of the final cases in the permanent storage section, she reflected on the thousands of stories that surrounded her in the quiet archive. Each file represented a moment when someone's life had been disrupted by crime, but also the patient work of police officers, social workers, counselors, and community members who had worked together to restore order, heal wounds, and prevent future problems. The archive served as more than just a repository for old case files. It was a library of human wisdom that documented the evolution of law enforcement from simple crime response to comprehensive community problem solving. The cases preserved here would serve as resources for future generations of police officers, policymakers, and researchers who were working to understand and address the complex social problems that contributed to criminal behavior. Margaret switched off the lights in the archive area and walked slowly toward the elevator that would carry her back to the main level of the building. Behind her, thousands of case files rested in their careful organization, holding their stories with the dignity and permanence that the people they represented deserved. The elevator doors closed softly, carrying Margaret upward toward the world of ongoing police work, where new cases were being investigated and new challenges were being addressed with the wisdom and experience that had been preserved in the archives below. The cycle would continue, with each generation of law enforcement professionals adding their own contributions to the accumulated knowledge that made effective policing possible. Above them, the city continued its restless movement through another night, its residents pursuing their daily lives with the confidence that came from knowing that dedicated professionals were working constantly to maintain the safety and order that civilized life required. The stories preserved in the archive below bore witness to this ongoing effort, testament to the patient work of building and maintaining communities where people could live, work, and raise their families in peace. The cases were closed, their stories complete, their lessons preserved for future generations who would face similar challenges and who would benefit from the wisdom that had been accumulated through decades of careful, thoughtful police work. In the quiet depths of the archive, these stories rested peacefully, their urgency transformed into understanding, their pain transformed into wisdom, their endings transformed into new beginnings for the communities they had served. The clock on the wall marked the passage of another day, but in the archive, time moved differently, measured not in hours and minutes, but in the longer rhythms of human learning and social progress that allowed each generation to build upon the achievements and insights of those who had come before. Here, in the patient accumulation of human experience, the real work of justice continued, creating the foundation upon which future peace and safety would be built. The sub-basement level of the police station existed in a realm that few officers had ever visited, accessed only through a service elevator that required special authorization and descended far below the familiar archives where Margaret Hoffman spent her days. This was where the oldest records rested, files from cases so ancient that their participants had long since passed into memory. Their urgency dissolved into the patient acceptance that time eventually brought to all human concerns. Custodian William Torres had been the sole caretaker of this deepest level for 38 years, maintaining the environmental controls that preserved documents dating back to the department's founding in 1892. His work was performed in solitude, moving through corridors lined with wooden filing cabinets that had been crafted when record-keeping was still an art form practiced by clerks who wrote in careful copperplate script with fountain pens that left permanent impressions on heavy paper. The air in the sub-basement carried the scent of aged paper and the faint mustiness that spoke of decades spent in protected darkness. The temperature remained constant year-round, maintained by systems that hummed with the steady persistence of machinery designed for purposes that transcended the immediate needs of daily police work. This was preservation in its purest form, the careful protection of human experience against the erosion of time and forgetting. William moved through his rounds with the measured pace of someone who understood that his work operated on timescales that extended far beyond ordinary human concerns. Each morning, he checked humidity levels, inspected seals on storage containers, and made notes in a logbook that he had maintained for nearly 4 decades. His entries were brief and factual, recording the unchanging conditions that allowed these ancient records to continue their patient existence. The earliest files in the SIS collection documented crimes from an era when the city had been a frontier settlement, when law enforcement consisted of a single marshal who served as judge, jury, and occasional executioner for a community that was still defining the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. These cases were recorded in language that reflected the formal education of their authors, but also the practical urgency of people who were creating order from chaos through the simple application of agreed-upon rules. Case number 1A, dated March 15, 1892, involved the theft of a horse from the livery stable that had stood where the current courthouse parking lot was located. The investigating marshal, John Morrison, had documented the case in handwriting that remained clear and legible more than a century later, describing his pursuit of the thief across terrain that was now covered by residential neighborhoods and shopping centers. The horse thief, identified as Samuel Garrett, had been captured after a 3-day pursuit that had taken Marshal Morrison as far as the creek that still bore the name Miller Creek, where Garrett's stolen mount had gone lame and left him stranded without transportation. The resolution of the case had been swift and final, with Garrett sentenced to 6 months of labor on public works projects that had included building the stone bridge that still carried pedestrians across Miller Creek. William paused in his reading of the Morrison file, struck by the continuity that connected these ancient cases to the contemporary police work that continued in the floors above. The same geographic landmarks appeared in reports separated by more than a century. The same human motivations drove criminal behavior across generations, and the same patient work of investigation and resolution continued, with methods that had evolved, but purposes that remained essentially unchanged. Files from the early 1900s reflected the community's growth from frontier settlement to established town, with cases that involved more complex forms of crime, but also more sophisticated approaches to investigation and prevention. The handwritten reports had given way to typed documents, and the single marshal had been replaced by a small but professional police force that served a community large enough to support specialized roles and procedures. Detective James Chun, great-grandfather of the contemporary detective Sarah Chun, had served the department from 1903 to 1934, documenting his cases with the same careful attention to detail that would characterize his descendants' work decades later. His files revealed a community that was struggling with the social changes that accompanied industrialization, as traditional patterns of life gave way to the complexity and anonymity that characterized urban existence. The Chun family's service to the department spanned 4 generations, creating a unique perspective on how police work had evolved over more than a century of social and technological change. Each generation had faced different challenges and had developed different approaches, but all had shared a commitment to the careful documentation and patient investigation that made effective law enforcement possible. William had observed this generational continuity in many of the families whose service was documented in the sub-basement files. The Morrison, Rodriguez, and Santos families had all contributed multiple generations to police work, creating informal traditions and accumulated wisdom that had shaped the department's culture and approach. These family connections provided continuity that transcended individual careers and created institutional memory that extended beyond formal record-keeping. Files from the 1920s and 1930s documented the community's response to prohibition and the economic difficulties of the Great Depression, challenges that had required creative approaches to law enforcement and community safety. Officers during this period had served multiple roles as social workers and economic advisors and community organizers, recognizing that crime was often a symptom of larger social problems that required comprehensive responses. Detective Maria Santos, grandmother of the contemporary Detective Santos, had specialized in cases involving family welfare during the Depression years, working with community organizations and religious groups to provide assistance that addressed the economic desperation that often led to criminal behavior. Her files documented an approach that emphasized prevention and social support rather than punishment, recognizing that many people who committed crimes during this period were motivated by genuine need rather than criminal intent. The Second World War had brought different challenges, with files documenting the homefront security measures that had been necessary to protect defense industries and maintain community morale during a period of unprecedented national mobilization. Officers had worked closely with federal agencies to monitor potential security threats, while also maintaining the community policing relationships that had characterized their work during peacetime. Detective Robert Morrison had served as the department's liaison with federal security agencies during the war years, coordinating investigations that involved potential sabotage or espionage while ensuring that security concerns did not compromise the civil liberties that the war was being fought to protect. His files reflected the careful balance that had been required to maintain both security and freedom during a period of national crisis. The post-war years had brought rapid social change as veterans returned to civilian life in the community, experienced unprecedented economic growth. The files from this period documented new forms of crime that reflected changing social patterns, but also new approaches to prevention and intervention that took advantage of expanded resources and improved understanding of human behavior. Williams' maintenance work had given him intimate knowledge of how these historical files were organized and preserved, but also how they connected to the ongoing work of contemporary law enforcement. The sub-basement served as the foundation for all the police work that continued above, providing the historical context and accumulated wisdom that informed current approaches to investigation and community safety. Environmental systems that William maintained operated with the same steady reliability as the law enforcement work they supported, creating conditions that allowed human experience to be preserved indefinitely for future generations who would face similar challenges and would benefit from the insights that previous generations had gained through their patient work. During his decades of service in the sub-basement, William had occasionally been visited by researchers, historians, and police administrators who needed access to historical records for various purposes. These visitors had often been surprised by the continuity they discovered in the files, the way that contemporary challenges had been faced by previous generations with similar approaches and similar results. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a criminologist at the local university, had spent several months in the sub-basement researching the historical development of community policing approaches, documenting how innovations in law enforcement had emerged from practical experience rather than academic theory. Her research had demonstrated that many approaches considered innovative in contemporary police work had actually been developed decades earlier by officers who had faced Similar challenges with fewer resources but equal dedication. Academic research that had been conducted in the sub-basement had contributed to training programs, and policy development that had improved contemporary police work, demonstrating that the preservation of historical records served practical as well as historical purposes. The wisdom documented in these old files continued to inform current approaches to law enforcement and community safety. Williams' work had also involved occasional consultation with contemporary investigators who were working on cold cases or trying to identify patterns that might span multiple decades. The historical files had sometimes provided crucial information that had helped solve cases or had revealed connections that had not been apparent when cases were initially investigated. Genealogical research that had been conducted in the sub-basement had revealed family connections that had influenced both criminal behavior and law enforcement response across multiple generations. Understanding these family histories had sometimes provided insights that had been crucial for resolving contemporary cases or preventing future problems. As William completed his evening rounds through the sub-basement, he reflected on the thousands of cases that surrounded him in their careful preservation. Each file represented a moment when someone's life had been disrupted by crime, but also the patient work of officers who had responded with professionalism, dedication, and genuine concern for community welfare. The sub-basement had become more than just a storage facility. It was a sanctuary where human experience was preserved with the reverence that it deserved, where the stories of disruption and resolution were held in trust for future generations who would need guidance and inspiration for their own work in maintaining justice and community safety. The silence of the sub-basement was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completion, where stories that had begun in urgency and confusion had found their way to resolution and peace. The files rested in their careful organization, holding their wisdom with the patience of teachers who understood that learning was a process that extended across generations and that the most important lessons were often those that required decades to fully understand. William locked the sub-basement and made his way to the service elevator that would carry him back to the world of ongoing police work, where new cases were being investigated and new challenges were being addressed with the benefit of the accumulated wisdom that he helped preserve. His work ensured that the insights gained through more than a century of law enforcement would remain available to guide future generations who would face similar challenges. With similar dedication, the elevator rose through the levels of the building, carrying William past the contemporary archives where Margaret Hoffman worked, past the detective bureaus where current cases were being investigated, past the administrative offices where policy decisions were being made that would shape the future of law enforcement. Each level built upon the foundation that the sub-basement provided, creating a structure of knowledge and experience that made effective police work possible. At street level, William emerged into the evening air of a city that continued its restless movement through another night, its residents pursuing their daily lives with the security that came from knowing that their safety was protected by officers who had access to more than a century of accumulated wisdom and experience. The police station continued its vigilant service to the community, with officers working through the night to respond to calls, investigate crimes, and maintain the order that civilized life required. Their work was supported by the vast archive of human experience that rested in the building's depths, where thousands of cases bore witness to the ongoing effort to maintain justice and community safety through the patient application of law and the careful preservation of human dignity. In the sub-basement, the oldest files continued their quiet existence, holding their stories with the permanence that time eventually brought to all human experience. The urgency that had once characterized these cases had been transformed into wisdom. Their pain had been transformed into learning, and their resolution had been transformed into the foundation upon which future justice would be built. The cycle continued, with each generation of law enforcement professionals adding their own contributions to the accumulated knowledge that made effective policing possible, ensuring that the work of maintaining community safety and human dignity would continue as long as people chose to live together in organized societies that valued justice, order, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. The silence of the sub-basement was the silence of completion, where every story had found its proper ending and every lesson had been preserved for those who would need its wisdom in the years and decades to come. Here, in the deepest quiet of institutional memory, the real work of justice continued, creating the foundation upon which all future peace and safety would rest. Above the sub-basement, above even the police station itself, above the city with its restless movement and constant change, there existed a realm that belonged neither to day nor night, but to the eternal present where all stories eventually led. Chief of Police Elizabeth Morrison had discovered this space during her 42 years of service, not as a physical location, but as a state of understanding that came only after decades of witnessing how human dramas played out across the vast stage of community life. Tonight, on the eve of her retirement, Chief Morrison sat in her office on the building's top floor, surrounded by windows that offered views of every neighborhood where she had served, every street where officers under her command had responded to calls, every corner where the complex dance between order and chaos played out in the endless rhythm of urban existence. The city spread before her like a vast map of human experience, each light representing a household, a family, a collection of individual stories that intersected in ways both visible and hidden. The reports that crossed Chief Morrison's desk each day represented only the smallest fraction of the human experience that unfolded within the city's boundaries. For every crime that was reported and investigated, countless other dramas resolved themselves through family conversations, community mediation, personal growth, and the simple passage of time that allowed most conflicts to fade into the background of ordinary life. Chief Morrison had learned to see police work not as a response to criminal behavior, but as participation in the larger human project of learning to live together peacefully despite differences in background, belief, and circumstance. The cases that filled the archives below her office were really lessons in the patient work of maintaining social order while preserving individual dignity and community trust. From her office windows, Chief Morrison could see the Miller Creek Bridge where Detective Chun often walked during evening patrols, observing the flow of community life that provided the context for all police work. The bridge connected not just two sides of a stream, but different eras of the city's development, different approaches to law enforcement, and different generations of officers who had dedicated their careers to protecting and serving their neighbors. The residential neighborhoods that stretched in every direction from the police station contained thousands of stories that would never appear in official reports, but that formed the foundation of community safety and social order. Children growing up in homes where they learned respect for others, elderly residents sharing their wisdom with younger neighbors, families working together to overcome difficulties and build better lives for future generations. Chief Morrison's understanding of police work had evolved through 4 decades of service that had begun with simple enforcement of traffic laws and noise ordinances, and had gradually expanded to encompass the full complexity of human behavior and community dynamics. She had learned that effective law enforcement required not just legal knowledge and investigative skills, but also empathy, patience, and the kind of wisdom that could only be gained through years of careful attention to how people actually lived their lives. The crime statistics that filled monthly reports and annual summaries told only part of the story of community safety and police effectiveness. The numbers that were never recorded were often more significant. The domestic disputes that were resolved through family counseling before they escalated into violence. The young people who chose constructive activities instead of criminal behavior. The neighborhoods that became safer through improved communication and cooperation rather than increased enforcement. Chief Morrison had watched several generations of officers develop from eager recruits into experienced professionals who understood that their most important work often involved preventing problems rather than simply responding to them after they occurred. The best officers learned to see themselves as guardians of community well-being rather than simply enforcers of criminal law, recognizing that their role extended far beyond the technical requirements of their positions. Detective Sarah Chun, whose family had served the department for 4 generations, represented the kind of institutional wisdom that made effective policing possible. Her approach to investigation combined technical skill with genuine understanding of human nature and community dynamics, allowing her to address not just immediate criminal behavior, but also the underlying factors that created conditions where crime was more likely to occur. The community policing initiatives that had been developed during Chief Morrison's tenure had demonstrated that crime prevention required partnership between law enforcement and residents who were willing to take active roles in maintaining neighborhood safety and social order. These partnerships had created informal networks of communication and cooperation that were often more effective than formal law enforcement in addressing problems before they required official intervention. Officer Maria Santos had become a model for community-oriented policing, building relationships with residents that allowed her to identify and address problems before they escalated into situations requiring arrest and prosecution. Her success had demonstrated that effective police work required understanding of local social dynamics and genuine commitment to serving community welfare. Rather than simply enforcing legal compliance, the restorative justice programs that had been implemented throughout the city had shown that many crimes could be addressed more effectively through processes that brought together victims, offenders, and community members to develop solutions that addressed harm while also creating opportunities for learning and growth. These approaches had proven more successful than traditional punishment in reducing recidivism and healing community relationships. Chief Morrison had supported the expansion of restorative justice programs because they aligned with her understanding that crime was often a symptom of larger social problems that required comprehensive responses rather than simply legal consequences. The programs had attracted support from victims who appreciated opportunities to participate in developing solutions and from offenders who valued chances to make direct amends for their actions. The youth programs that had been developed in partnership with schools and community organizations had created alternatives to traditional juvenile justice approaches that emphasized education and skill development rather than punishment and detention. These programs had been particularly successful in preventing repeat offenses and helping young people develop positive relationships with law enforcement personnel. Detective Jennifer Walsh had specialized in working with at-risk youth, developing programs that addressed the family, educational, and economic factors that often contributed to criminal behavior among teenagers. Her approach emphasized building trust and providing support rather than simply enforcing compliance, recognizing that young people needed positive alternatives and adult guidance to make constructive choices. The mental health crisis intervention programs that had been implemented During Chief Morrison's tenure had improved responses to calls involving individuals experiencing psychological difficulties, connecting people with appropriate treatment and support services rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system. These programs had reduced both arrests and repeat calls while also improving outcomes for people who were struggling with mental health challenges. Officer David Thompson had received specialized training in crisis intervention techniques, allowing him to de-escalate situations involving mental health crises while connecting individuals with resources that addressed underlying problems rather than just immediate symptoms. His work had demonstrated that many situations traditionally handled through arrest and prosecution could be resolved more effectively through social service intervention and ongoing support. The domestic violence prevention programs that had been developed in partnership with social service agencies and legal advocacy organizations had created comprehensive responses that addressed both immediate safety concerns and the long-term factors that contributed to family violence. These programs had been successful in breaking cycles of abuse while preserving family relationships whenever possible. Detective Robert Morrison had coordinated the department's domestic violence response efforts, working with community organizations to develop approaches that prioritized victim safety while also providing support and intervention for perpetrators who were willing to participate in treatment and education programs. His work had demonstrated that effective domestic violence prevention required sustained commitment and comprehensive resources rather than simply law enforcement response. The elder abuse prevention programs that had been implemented throughout the city had created networks of support and monitoring that protected vulnerable elderly residents while preserving their independence and dignity. These programs had involved training for officers, social workers, and community volunteers who could identify signs of abuse and connect elderly residents with appropriate assistance. Officer Patricia Rodriguez had developed expertise in elder abuse investigation, learning to balance protection of vulnerable adults with respect for their autonomy and desire to maintain independence. Her approach had emphasized building trust with elderly residents and their families while creating safety plans that addressed specific risks without unnecessarily restricting freedom or family relationships. The substance abuse intervention programs that had been developed in partnership with treatment providers and recovery support organizations had created alternatives to traditional criminal justice responses that emphasized treatment and recovery rather than simply punishment and incarceration. These programs had been successful in reducing both crime and addiction, while helping individuals rebuild their lives and relationships. Detective Patricia Chun had worked closely with treatment providers to develop intervention approaches that recognized addiction as a health issue rather than simply a criminal justice problem. Her work had demonstrated that many individuals involved in drug-related crimes could be helped more effectively through treatment and support than through traditional prosecution and incarceration. As Chief Morrison prepared to leave her office for the final time, she reflected on the thousands of officers who had served under her command and the countless community members who had worked with the department to maintain safety and order throughout the city. Each individual had contributed to the larger effort of creating conditions where people could live, work, and raise their families without fear of crime or disorder. The police station would continue its vigilant service to the community long after Chief Morrison's retirement, with new generations of officers carrying forward the traditions and approaches that had been developed through decades of careful attention to what actually worked in maintaining community safety and social order. The building itself had become a symbol of the community's commitment to justice and protection for all residents. The archives in the building's basement levels would continue to preserve the accumulated wisdom of generations of police work, holding thousands of stories that documented both the challenges and the successes that had characterized law enforcement in an increasingly complex, urban environment. These records would serve as resources for future officers who would face similar challenges with similar dedication and commitment. The community partnerships that had been developed during Chief Morrison's tenure would continue to evolve and grow, creating new opportunities for collaboration between law enforcement and residents who shared common interests in maintaining neighborhood safety and social cohesion. These partnerships had demonstrated that effective crime prevention required ongoing engagement and mutual support rather than simply professional law enforcement response. The training programs that had been developed to prepare officers for community-oriented policing would continue to emphasize the skills and attitudes that had proven most effective in building trust and cooperation between law enforcement and the communities they served. These programs had demonstrated that effective police work required not just technical knowledge but also emotional intelligence and genuine commitment to community welfare. As Chief Morrison turned off the lights in her office and prepared to leave the building that had been her second home for more than 4 decades, she carried with her the understanding that police work was ultimately about participating in the larger human project of learning to live together peacefully and constructively despite differences and difficulties that would always be part of community life. The city beyond the police station windows continued its restless movement through another night, its residents pursuing their daily lives with the confidence that came from knowing that dedicated professionals were working constantly to maintain the safety and order that civilized life required. The stories that had filled Chief Morrison's career would continue to unfold in new variations, with new challenges and new opportunities for growth and learning. The elevator carried Chief Morrison down through the building one final time, past the detective bureaus where investigations continued, past the archives where thousands of cases rested in their careful preservation, past the sub-basement where the oldest records held their wisdom in patient silence. Each level represented a different aspect of the ongoing work of maintaining justice and community safety through the patient application of law and the careful preservation of human dignity. At street level, Chief Morrison emerged into the evening air of a city that had been shaped by decades of thoughtful police work and community partnership. The neighborhoods that surrounded the police station were safer and stronger because of the collaborative efforts of officers and residents who had learned to work together in addressing shared challenges and maintaining common values. The peace that Chief Morrison had discovered after 4 decades of police work was not the absence of problems, but the understanding that every challenge was also an opportunity for growth and learning. That every crisis was also a chance for people to demonstrate their capacity for cooperation and mutual support. And that every story of disruption was also a story of potential restoration and healing. In the space beyond the individual stories and cases and investigations, beyond even the careful preservation of institutional memory and accumulated wisdom, there existed a deeper understanding that all human experience was part of a larger pattern of growth and learning that extended far beyond any individual lifetime or career. Here, in this space of ultimate perspective, Chief Morrison had found the peace that came from understanding her role in something infinitely larger than herself. The stories would continue, with new officers and new challenges and new opportunities for service and growth. The work of maintaining justice and community safety would continue as long as people chose to live together in organized societies that valued protection for the vulnerable and accountability for those who caused harm. The peace that surrounded all these stories was the peace of knowing that the work itself was eternal and meaningful, regardless of the temporary nature of any individual contribution. Here, at the edge of all storytelling, where individual narratives dissolved into the larger pattern of human experience, Chief Morrison had found the rest that came from understanding that every story was part of a story so large that it could never be fully told, but could always be lived with dignity, compassion, and hope for future generations who would carry the work forward into whatever challenges and opportunities awaited them in the years to come.